Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is The Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 6, Eccidentégiste. X. Ichigo fell to the floor with a hard jolt, his eyes snapping open, while the breath was stolen from his lungs. With a quiet groan, Ichigo reached out blindly in the darkness, searching for the nightstand that stood as sentinel beside his bed. Grasping the wood firmly beneath nimble fingers, he used it as a support to push himself up. Ichigo swayed where he stood, whether from the blood rushing to his head or the memories that overcame him was uncertain. Blindly, Ichigo fumbled about the room for a few moments until he reached one of the small oil lamps on his desk. With a gentle prod from his Reisu, the wick caught fire, filling the room with a warm honey-colored glow. Ichigo slumped into the wood frame that served as his desk chair, his hands coming up to hold his head, a slight pounding echoing throughout it. Glancing up from his hands, Ichigo's eyes landed on the doorway, a thin beam of light shining from underneath as if beckoning him forward. The quiet hum of encouragement and comfort in the back of his mind only assured him of his decision. Pushing himself up from the chair, Ichigo paced to his closet and fetched a cloak of ebony from the back, hardly to be seen in the darkness of the night. Swinging it around his shoulders and pulling the hood over his eyes, he slipped from the room, his feet like a soft breeze upon the paneled floors. The cold wind of night blew through the air and Ichigo shivered for a moment, sheltered under a stone overhang, staring at the looming expanse of land in front of him. No hesitation lingered in his soul, and with a last turn towards the academy, he spotted a silhouette against one of the windows, watching like a phantom of the night. His eyes connected with that of the figure in the window for a tense moment before the figure turned away, leaving only the swaying curtains in his wake. Ichigo turned and fled the courtyard, traveling far into the outer districts of Rungokai. X. The door clamored shut behind Ichigo as he strode into the cozy tavern, which appeared much like a dilapidated shack from the outside, but was warm with a homey manner about it on the inside. The few patrons of the bar stared at Ichigo for a few moments, scrutinizing his every move with eyes full of suspicion. It was unusual to see an outsider grace these careworn floors. Sashitsutate was a unique alehouse in that it was not widely known. Very few had graced the cherry wood tables and sat by the bright fireplace, a source of warmth on many a cool night. Ichigo stumbled upon it during the war quite accidentally when he was chasing after one of their own who had betrayed them to the enemy. The man was not overly strong but was fast like a hare and led Ichigo on a wild goose chase through Rungokai. It was pure luck, as usual, on Ichigo's part, that the man fell asleep, a victim to the nursery rhyme of old. Once Ichigo dispatched the traitor, he realized he was quite thoroughly lost. He wandered for some time before stumbling upon what appeared to be a ruined building. With the coming storm clouds on the horizon, he decided to seek shelter. Entering, he saw that the outside did not truly reflect the inside in the slightest. And now he was here again, in a place where one was not jostled and mead not forced down your throat. Pulling out one of the discolored bar stools, Ichigo gracefully slid into it, a pale hand reaching to tip back his hood, letting bright orange strands free once more. The barkeep, a thin man with a beak-like nose, a mop of curled brown hair, and a pleasant smile, sidled up to Ichigo, a curious light in his eyes as he carefully dried a small tankard in his hands. His coarse and deep voice echoed softly between the two as he asked, "What will ya be having this evening?" Ichigo smiled softly. Another reason he liked the place was the lack of questions. Ichigo, though old in mind, still appeared to be the age of 18, and oftentimes when one couldn't see his eyes he was questioned thoroughly. It confused Ichigo slightly, and Yorichi and Kisuke always laughed about it before telling him with appeasing smiles that he had a vulnerable look about him. Ichigo never understood what they meant by such words but chose to ignore the subject most of the time. Ichigo picked up one of the aged pieces of washi paper, feeling the unique texture, unlike the one he was familiar with in modern society, beneath calloused fingers. Studying the options for a moment, he pointed at one of the middle-priced options and reached inside his cloak pocket to pull out the desired change. The steward, for that was the position he occupied along with his kind and fresh-faced wife, nodded and bustled away with the clinking of glasses ringing after him. Ichigo tensed slightly as a presence familiar to his senses slid onto the bar stool next to him. Turning slightly, Ichigo's first impression was of strawberry blonde hair and a chiseled face. Eyes widening slightly, Ichigo stared at Rajuro Odoribashi, better known as Rose. The Shinigami captain was swirling a clear glass of rich red liquid and staring at it as if it held complex answers to the problem he sought. As if feeling Ichigo's eyes on him, Rose turned, his own eyes obviously catching Ichigo's own shocking hair, glowing like the embers of a fire in the dim lighting. Seeing Rose's face up close brought up the memory of his death. Piano strings tied around his neck, his face pale with the blue pallor of death and many gashes littering his torso, the dissonant notes ringing forebodingly in the background of the cool night as he passed defending one of the many districts, allowing the occupants to flee at the cost of his life. Ichigo let the memory go, flowing like a leaf in the rapid river of Ichigo's torrential mind. What is one so young as you doing on a night like this? Drinking away troubles that plague the mind. Rose's rich and honeyed voice flowed softly between the two and Ichigo nodded slightly ready to reply in kind when the barkeep bustled back with his drink and placed in front of him with sharp incline of his head. Ichigo lifted the glass and scented the strong sake, wincing slightly at the burn that accompanied it before tipping the misty glass and letting the scorching liquid trail down his throat. Setting his drink down once more he turned to face Rose and said, "Indeed, for my mind wearies me with visions of abundant chaos. What about you with fingers of a musician?" Rose chuckled softly at Ichigo's flowery words, his eyebrow arched slightly in interest. The blonde took a sip of his drink, setting the glass down with a soft clink and said, "I am a musician of a kind. The life of a Shinigami can be morose at times, but I seek to fill it with the graceful harmonies of my Zanpakuto. And you? Where do you stand now?" Ichigo smiled slightly. It was not widely known that he was a fan of Shakespeare's works, and speaking in such tongues as they were conversing delighted him. It was rare for Ichigo and Rose to talk in such ways in the timeline in which he once dwelled. For then there was a border of age and familiarity wrought not of kinship. But for two strangers in a bar to speak in such mannerisms was merely a passing coincidence one might find. "I study at the academy, which is many days full of melancholy when one must listen to the droning on of lessons already taught." "What led you to this bar? For those who find it are rare among the many, and always there is a tale behind the eyes." Rose sipped at his glass once more, casting an amused glance in his direction before tilting his side as if to try and remember the event that led him through rusted doors that swung with a gently push. It was the music. One night a lady of great beauty with almond eyes, caramel hair, and a voice like the many seraphs of heaven, clambered onto one of the chairs littered throughout and with the night's pleasure sang of seasons. "I was wandering the nearby district as my squad was searching for a hollow reported to be seen nearby. Such a heavenly litany could not be ignored, and my feet were pulled towards the sound until I came upon grey wood and light like honey spilling from within. And you with hair like the flames one might stroke in the fire." Ichigo looked towards the door for a second, a slight frown on his face as he considered the question before his eyes brightened with a solution to the slight problem that presented itself. "A man of small stature with beady eyes and the narrowed face of a rat, stole an heirloom of my family. In anger I chased after him, and though he was weak of body, his legs pumped with the blood of Kami, he seemed to fly across the fields as I dashed after him. It is his foolishness that doomed him, for when his body complained he lay down to rest, thinking me far behind his trail. I caught up to him within minutes and swiftly returned what was stolen to my hands, and left a warning of justice to greet him shall he wake. It was there in a field with a tree of gnarled and twisted bark that I found myself lost with no sense of direction in mind. I drifted aimlessly for many a fortnight before stumbling upon what appeared to be a ruined building. A storm drew near and heavy tension hung in the air. I chose to enter such meager protection rather than brave such errant weather." Rose smiled and lifted his glass towards Ichigo. Inclining his head, Ichigo picked up his own, and with a chorus of "to misadventures," they clashed their drink together, drops lifting from the cup and glinting in the low tavern light. They spoke of many a thing that night, and Ichigo gained a new understanding of the musician. There was also the bonus of finally having some dirt on the captains that he would soon walk amongst. "You are young, no? Joining us soon you will find we are a tricky lot and hard to play with. But I like you, an aura of something else hangs around you, and with it a future incomprehensible. If it were any other man sitting in front of me he would hear no such words. So listen well, as my tales come at no price for this night." What had followed was laughter and a smile that sat softly upon his face as he heard tales that never once graced his ears in his own timeline. His mind did not dwell on the sorrow of hours before, and only the soft rays of sun peeked through those memories. Stumbling slightly through the door, Ichigo peered through the thick curtains to see the sun rising, squinting slightly at the light that invaded his corneas. Ichigo turned away from the window and trudged to his bed. With one last look at the door, Ichigo tucked himself in. It was not so much the alcohol that put him in such ill health, for he could drink far more than he and Rose consumed and still be limber with energy. Rather it was the lack of sleep and the prospect of missing school that enticed him to roll himself into bed. Byakuya cast a concerned gaze upon the imposing Shinigami Academy, searching for a shock of orange hair among the many students milling about their lunch break. It was Ichigo's normal routine to be up before sunrise and outside Byakuya's dorm 20 minutes before class, and so Byakuya was surprised when only an empty hallway greeted him in the morn. He had just left the Orangette's room in an attempt to wake him, and was hoping the Shiba would be grouchy, but in front of him within a few moments, he found the prospect highly unlikely. His mind flashed to the night before when some phantom sixth sense had awoken him from the comfort of his bed and guided him to the window. He pulled the curtains of thick satin away to peer upon the courtyard below, where cobbled stone appeared to glow slightly in the luminous hues of the moon. It was then that movement at the corner of his eyes dragged his attention to the stone overhang that graced the courtyard's entrance. A figure stood huddled under the high arch of stone, a cloak of darkness wrapped around their frame. As if noticing Byakuya's own motions, the figure whipped around, eyes hidden by shadows connecting with Byakuya's sleek gray ones. A sense of unease had descended upon Byakuya's shoulders as for a small slice of eternity he stared at the figure below. Byakuya turned from the curtains as the seductive call of sleep whispered in his ears, encouraging him to forget of the strange figure below the window. Byakuya wondered now if under the cover of darkness hung vibrant orange hair and caramel eyes of soft dexterity. Distracted in his thoughts, Byakuya turned from the academy building and glided towards one of the sakura trees shaded slightly by the stone-set walls guarding the grounds. Byakuya whipped around suddenly when a heavy spiritual pressure drew near to where he stood. The Reisu was reminiscent of Ichigo's own, a trace of familiarity hiding in it. A shock of ebony hair appeared in his view, and Byakuya's tense shoulders settled slightly as he saw it was only the Shiba head, Ichigo's brother Kion. A sense of calm danger hung about the man as his eyes alighted on Byakuya, and he quickened his pace. Stopping in front of Byakuya, a small frown identical to the one that sometimes rested on Ichigo's face, Kion's eyes raked over him, assessing his every aspect with intense scrutiny before the man's smooth voice said, Kokeki, what do you seek to gain in being friends with my brother? Byakuya's eyes widened. He had met the Shiba head many times before at the noble galas and balls, but that was before Ichigo's stormy presence burst into his life and took him by the hand. Truthfully, he had expected some suspicion from Kion. Byakuya saw the way Kion would glance at Ichigo, a fierce protection shining in silver eyes. The man was a Shiba, and if there was one thing the noble family did well, other than their fireworks, was protect their own. I am not quite certain what you mean. I seek only the presence of intelligence in the academy and have found it in Ichigo. Indeed, his strength is admirable, and I doubt I will ever come within 50 feet of it. That is why I seek to better myself by training with him, but it is not the reason I find companionship with him. His status means nothing to me, as we are both of noble houses. Once one knows him, you can see the compassion and empathy that shines in his eyes, the determination that rests in his soul, the care of all, even those who pose harm, and if he has shown me the error of my ways, then I am only the more thankful because of it. I seek nothing from him. Being his friend is far more of a reward than any gift of power. Kion nodded, a proud smile resting on his face. His voice echoed softly between the two as he said, I see. I'm glad Ichigo has found a friend such as yourself. Within his heart there rests a great darkness. I fear that if nothing is done we shall lose him to it. A sentinel of light stands beside him then. Take care of him, Kokeki, or by my wrath you will taste my blade. His words were melodious, and a soft pondering echoed underneath them, but at the end of his words his eyes darkened like a storm upon the bluffs, and dark promise rested within those craggy depths. Byakuya nodded, a spark of determination coloring his eyes, a fierce silver as if just forged into a new blade. Kion's demeanor seemed to change in an instant, the serious and protecting older brother disappearing behind a mask of fake obtuseness. The sky suddenly seemed brighter as a goofy smile settled on the Shiba head's face. By the way, where is Ichigo? Although what Ichigo fondly dubbed Shiba obliviousness had made a reappearance, Byakuya could still see the spine of steel lacing those words. Gazing at the school for a moment, Byakuya sighed and rubbed a hand over his eyes before saying, asleep. I ventured to his rooms before exiting the building. I knocked and I heard something along the lines of come in, so I entered his dorm to see him rolled up in far too many layers of blankets to count. His eyes when cast upon me were slightly venomous, and we stared each other down before I told him it was lunch. He nodded and rolled over, mumbling something about going to school tomorrow. I left it at that, hoping he would come out soon after. I have not been so fortunate. With a mumble of skipping school, Kyan nodded, his own eyes tracing the imposing building before he turned to Byakuya with his goofy smile once more and said, I best be getting back to the squad before Taiko is displeased. Tell Ichi I said hi and that he should come for dinner soon. With those parting words the lieutenant flash stepped away, leaving a bemused Byakuya under the sakura tree. He glanced at the school and cursed slightly when he realized Kyan had wasted much of his lunch time. Shaking his head, the young noble ventured inside the school, glancing upwards with a fond smile. Ichigo's head casually swiveled from side to side as he glanced at the many vendors and colorful silks lining wooden stalls. Byakuya walked beside him, an irritated look gracing chiseled features, as much as emotion can grace a noble's face in public. Ichigo hummed softly to himself as he led Byakuya through the crowded streets. The store Ichigo sought held a book bound in many layers of leather, and Ichigo was curious if such power still rested behind dank cabinets and moth-eaten curtains. Byakuya, with curiosity piqued, had asked to come. Ichigo only arched an eyebrow curiously before nodding. Ichigo veered off the street's busy path and glided towards one of the stores tucked into a dark corner. The name of the shop was impossible to read as the paint was peeled, the wood was draped with mold, and dirt clung to the sign like a second skin. Ichigo glanced back at Byakuya with an amused expression before sliding the door with a small click and stepping into the dingy atmosphere. The building appeared far worse on the inside rather than the outside. It was a clutter of old furniture crumbing in on one another, stacks of dusty books that threatened to topple at any moment with the gentlest of gales. The windows covered with a thick layer of grime let only the barest sliver of light in, giving the room a feel of decay and abandonment. Byakuya glanced around with a raised eyebrow and hint of disgust as Ichigo ventured further into the store, letting his Reisu map a path of safety as items spun and twirled left and right. With a slight sense of finality, Ichigo came upon a large wardrobe of carved wood. A glow seemed to lie in its polished wood, and it provided a faint hint of light in the darkness. Byakuya gazed upon the object with wide eyes, before those charcoal orbs swiveled and landed on Ichigo curiously. A relic from times long ago. I am quite sure the Suteiko would recognize it from his own younger years. Everything has a way of finding themselves here, this shop of the broken glory. Ichigo's voice was barely above a whisper, a quiet decibel that Byakuya had to strain to hear. Ichigo nodded slightly, stepping forward and letting his hand glide across the smooth wood, feeling the rich grain beneath calloused pads. Reaching upwards slightly, Ichigo let his forefinger drag against a small blossom, a curled rose engraved into the wood. The sound of gears shifting slightly echoed throughout the shop as Ichigo let his finger add pressure slightly before drawing back. The wardrobe shifted slightly to the right on invisible rollers, revealing a small nook carved into the wall. A smile danced across Ichigo's face and he took a step closer, letting his Reisu gently caress the nook, searching for anything malignant. When nothing of the sort was revealed, Ichigo carefully grasped what was hidden by the darkness, the long sleeves of his shiakusho covering his pale hands. Ichigo carefully slid the heavily bound book from the darkness, aware of Byakuya's bated breath and confusion. The tome resting heavy in his arms, Ichigo walked slowly to the front of the store, stopping in front of a counter laden with trinkets that glimmered in heavy darkness. Slowly, as if a robot coming alive after many years frozen in the same place, a carved with wrinkles and crystal blue eyes that peered out from deep sockets revealed itself in the form of a wizened old woman. Find what you seek. Her voice was hoarse with disuse and was much like the croaking of the frogs on a moonlit night, but her smile, though few of teeth, was pleasant with crinkled laugh lines around soft eyes. Ichigo nodded and lightly rested the novel on the counter. Her eyebrows reached her hairline and an amused smile perched upon her lips as she regarded Ichigo with new interest. Are you sure this is what you seek? Ichigo nodded, his voice coming out in soft rich tones as he said, indeed, for the wisdom bound in these pages is extravagance for the mind full of melancholy. She nodded and Ichigo rummaged around slightly before pulling forth the desired change in a bit extra. The soul in front of him only smiled with a slight nod of kindness to her tone as she said, feel free to come back and look, my doors are always open to Horosha. Ichigo nodded and carefully lifted the thick tome before sweeping out of the store of mystery, a curious Byakuya following behind him with impatience thick on his tongue. Ichigo led Byakuya to one of the dango stands lining the streets and ordered two before turning to face Byakuya, who now had a slight tick above his eyebrow. Perhaps you can explain to me the fiasco that just occurred. His smooth voice rang between the two and a soft sigh followed as Byakuya drew a hand over his eyes, regarding Ichigo with a slightly condescending look. Ichigo opened his mouth to answer when they were handed the sweet treats. Smiling softly at the rich scent that drifted towards his nose, he led Byakuya to a small alcove hidden from the sun where they might continue their conversation in privacy. It's something far lost to time, full of origins and theories. Byakuya only raised his brow, obviously unsatisfied with the answer. His shoulders slumped and he seemed to let the question pass, most likely chalking it up to one of Ichigo's weird quirks. Ichigo smiled softly, finishing the sweet dango before asking, "Any other shops you'd like to look at?" "We don't have any classes for the rest of the day." Byakuya nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he glanced around the busy streets, seeing the souls aimlessly wander by. His deep, smooth tone lifted softly between them as he said, "I'm looking for a pair of Kensei Ken as Jinrei wishes me to prepare for becoming a noble." Ichigo nodded, and with a smile he gestured with a wide arm towards the crowded ways. Byakuya's lips twitched slightly and they ventured into the crowds, browsing the many shops and carts selling their wares. Kukaki-sama. Kukaki-sama. Byakuya and Ichigo whirled around as the loud call cut through the bubble of conversation that the busy streets echoed. A lower-ranking Shinigami with short dark green hair and wide pecan eyes pushed through the crowds, breaking free of their oppressive mass, dashing towards the two nobles. The Shinigami bowed at the waist as he stood before the two. Byakuya with a small wave of his hand gestured for the nervous Shinigami to speak, an aura of control and dominance replacing Byakuya's casual smile. "Kukaki-sama, Kukaki Teiko wishes to speak to you. He says it is a matter of utmost importance." Byakuya nodded, a slight frown marring noble features before he turned to Ichigo with an apologetic smile. Ichigo nodded sadly, a soft smile mirrored on his own face before he said, "Go. I understand there will be many more a day where we may endlessly walk the streets and talk of nothing." Byakuya nodded, and placing a warm hand on his friend's shoulder he gave a tight squeeze, his eyes conveying a promise of such things in a soft smile before following the young Shinigami who watched their encounter with wide eyes. Ichigo gazed after Byakuya with something akin to a forlorn look in his eyes, the tome still clenched tightly in his hands. His head turned and he let his eyes glide across the busy streets and carved shop signs. With a slight nod Ichigo pushed forward and began to wade through the crowd much like one would try to wade through maple syrup. With a slight push he appeared on the other side of the street where the traffic was significantly less dense. Letting the wind blowing orange locks about guide him, Ichigo turned to the left and began to glide up the streets, a slight tenseness to his shoulders and his eyes casting about, searching for danger even as his mind drifted upon a lazy current of minimal thoughts. Spotting a sign carved with intricate flowers and a dragon curling around the elegant script, Ichigo stepped closer so he could gaze upon the window display. He saw that it held a variety of different objects. Bejeweled sword sheaths glittered in the afternoon sun, long beads of pearl, amethyst, and onyx dangled tantalizing from beams above. A few books lay open upon a desk where maps and other sheaths of paper cluttered the floor around it, and perhaps the grand center of all stood a thick and heavy trunk with fabric of a deep rose settled on it. On a coat rack beside the box there were many more garments of iris, basil, cream, cobalt, strawberry, and raven. With his curiosity piqued, Ichigo slid aside the door and stepped inside, breathing the heavy scent of incense, a sweet scent with rich tones of lemon hidden underneath. Movement at the far corner of the store alerted Ichigo to the presence of the clerk, who was high upon a frail ladder gazing at a glass bottle filled with a murky substance and a worn label. The man, who was likely in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and teal eyes, smiled at Ichigo and clambered down, bringing with him the bottle of mysterious liquid. "How can I be of assistance to you today, sir?" The man's voice was rich and reminded Ichigo of melted chocolate slowly being poured. Smiling kindly in greeting, Ichigo replied, "I was merely passing through when I saw the collection of valuables in your store. The catching of the light has caught my eye." The man nodded and bustled away with a gentle smile and kind words of assistance if needed. Ichigo slowly walked around the store, gazing at the many trinkets that lay in shuttered boxes and glass casing. Coming close to the trunk in the middle, Ichigo could see that the fabrics were all ceremonial kimonos. The rose-colored one caught his eye once again, making him think of Kukeku and the likeness of being hit by a wooden spoon if he were to ever venture to the Shiba mansion. Turning away with a slight shiver, a soft glint of metal in the corner of his eye attracted his attention. Ichigo glided towards the light, his eyes landing on a pair of finely carved Kensei Kan. The lines dipped and flowed into one another, illuminating the image of soft cherry blossoms descending. These were far different from the ones Byakuya wore in Ichigo's own time. These ones were not cold harsh steel with a simple pattern. These spoke of growth and the love of craftsmanship put into their making. Glancing around, his heart decided Ichigo spotted the sales clerk dusting off a tall vase with a 5-toed dragon etched in gold. Ichigo called out carefully so as to not disturb the man in his work. The clerk nodded and placed the vase down before he strolled over, an interesting gleam in teal eyes. "Ah, those Kenseiken are indeed fine, crafted from silver in the Emperor's forge, and carved with the delicate hand of a master goldsmith. Are you interested in buying the pair for yourself?" Ichigo shook his head with a quiet chuckle, the image of him wearing them floating in his mind's eyes. Ichigo's eyes gleamed with amusement as he said, "No, they are for a friend, as he is soon gracing the position of head of the family." The man nodded and they moved on to discuss the price. Ichigo agreed to the allotted amount and the Kenseiken were soon wrapped up in thick paper and placed inside a small box. Ichigo thanked the man and trekked to the door, calling out a thanks as he let the thin frame slide shut behind him. Ichigo paused for a moment to take in a deep breath, his eyes tracking the sun's lazy progress towards night as soft evening descended like a warm blanket. The peace was disturbed when a familiar presence graced his sense. Turning with a tired sigh and slump of his shoulders, Ichigo was greeted with Kaien's spiky ebony hair and determined flint eyes. Upon spotting Ichigo, his face lit up like a puppy when their master arrived home, and he sped towards Ichigo with a jovial smile alight on his face. "Ichigo! What a surprise to meet you here of all places! You won't believe what happened today. But that's a story for another time. What are you carrying?" Ichigo's brow twitched uncontrollably and he took a soft breath to steady himself. Ichigo's wasn't quite sure what it was that upset him when Kaien was in his spastic hyper mode, but it always dug under his skin and every word was 1,000 times worse. Kaien was fine when he was calm or serious. He could be sensible and Ichigo could talk to him without fear of sudden spine-crushing hugs and crocodile tears. "It's a gift, I just bought it." Ichigo spoke with much hesitation, knowing it better than to let Kaien wallow like a petulant child. Kaien gazed curiously at the box, his upper body swinging gently from side to side as to better observe the mystery item. Kaien glanced back up at Ichigo and said, "Is it for me?" Ichigo shook his head and Kaien continued in a moping voice, "How cruel. Nothing for your big brother?" "Oh, I know. I bet it's for Byakuya. I guess the rumors are true. Yorichi owes me." Ichigo clenched his fist and took a deep breath as Kaien raised his brows, trying to instigate what his words did not clearly state. Ichigo tried to think of a response that wouldn't end with Kaien's strangulation and an awkward explanation. Pulling his hand softly over his face, Ichigo said, "It nothing like that, it's just a gift between friends." "And why would I get you a gift when you annoy the ever-living angels above every time you speak to me?" Kaien took a minute to stare at the box once more before he made a non-committal sound of doubt. Then the second part of Ichigo's sentence kicked in and Kaien began to pout, his eyes growing dramatically wide as he flung his arms around Ichigo with a cry of, "My cruel brother! Oh, woe is you, so full of bitterness." Ichigo frowned and said, "Kaien, I'm giving you a warning, tread carefully or you may find that you should have ran the local marathon." Kaien pouted before a wicked gleam entered his eyes and in a sing-song, teasing voice he responded, "Oh, like you chase after Byakuya." Ichigo growled and reached out to grab Kaien, who was wisely already a short distance away, with wide eyes and the mumbling of, "Bad idea, very bad idea," echoing loudly around him. Ichigo twisted his neck slightly and with a sadistic smile that would make Shiro proud he raced after Kaien. The thin paper doors clattered open with a large bang, echoing through the dimly lit restaurant where Shinji was seated with Jushiro and Shunsui. They had invited Kisuke, but he had denied, claiming he was close to breaking through in one of his experiments. Shaking himself from wandering thoughts, the blonde glanced towards the door to see Kaien Shiba panting, bent over with his hands on his knees. The young lieutenant slowly straightened up, his eyes casting around with a hue of fear. Upon spotting the three captains, Kaien's eyes lit up with relief and tense shoulders drooped slightly before he sashayed towards the small table situated in the far corner of the warm and crowded room. "What has ya bursting in here in such a hasty manner?" Shinji inquired as Kaien stopped in front of their table and sat down on one of the plush cushion with a soft sigh when Jushiro gestured for it. Kaien let out a tense laugh, eyes glancing once more towards the door before saying, "Ichigo, I'm afraid that I might have made a very grave mistake in ticking him off. I have no doubt that any second now his vibrant hair will grace the scene and I will turn a shade of green." Shinji snorted, an eyebrow arched in skepticism, while Jushiro and Shunsui regarded Kaien with varying looks of sympathy and amusement. Still a bit confused, as he had heard bits and pieces of Kaien's new little brother, but as of yet he had no concrete information, other than the fact that his lieutenant eyed him like a wolf to a hare. What did ya do to tick off ya brother? Kyan smiled at the memory before clearing his throat to answer Shinji's question. The ebony-haired lieutenant glanced around the small tavern, apparently just taking in the scenery before replying, I might have been overhyper, as Ichigo dubs it, and I might have insinuated that Byakuya and Ichigo are dating again. It would likely have been wiser for me at that point to keep my mouth shut, but Kami knows I have no such luck in these matters. Shunsui laughed at Kyan's words, his cheeks staining a pale rose as the force of his laughter slightly overtook him. Jushiro looked at his friend, his eyes glancing between his lieutenant, who was moping in indignation, and Shunsui, who was slightly gasping for breath now, and let out a soft chuckle. Why are the three of you meeting here? Kyan's voice pulled the three back to the moment at hand, and Jushiro shared a glance with the other occupants of the low table before his soothing and gentle voice said, Ashu and I usually like to go out once a month, so Shu can eye the ladies without Lisa-chan getting on his back. Shinji wanted to talk with us in particular about his lieutenant, Sosuke-san. Kyan's eyes darkened at the mention of Aizen, and Shinji felt a bitter taste enter his mouth, thinking about the sense of unease that haunted his barracks whenever the man was near, not to mention the little fox that followed him like a puppy. The sudden dark atmosphere was dispersed when a Reisu presence of great magnitude began to approach the inn. Shinji's eyebrows shot up in surprise, as even though the Reisu was suppressed under tight lock, it still snaked through your senses, clouding your sense with its power. Kyan began to cower and shake where he stood, and as the door began to slide open, an ominous aura of deep plum and oil seemed to slither in through the small crack. With a quiet sound, Kyan dove under the table, trying to hide himself from the foe at the door. Shinji's first impression of Ichigo was the color orange. Such a bright color drew one's eye to the untamable and spiky hair immediately. Letting his eyes trail down slightly, Shinji could see warm chocolate eyes that swirled with hints of emotion, sharp features that could cut through butter. Ichigo's hair rested in a long ponytail at the back of his neck, a mess of hair with strands trailing everywhere. A slim build hid under a simple shiakusho of raven, and the hilt of a blade was visible over his shoulder, wrapped in white bandages. Chocolate orbs trailed around the room, mirroring Kyan's earlier actions before landing on the three captains. Ichigo winced, a frown flashing across his face as his eyes seemed to focus on Shinji. Ichigo had stood outside the tavern for 10 minutes trying to prepare himself to see Shinji Hirako alive and well. He worried no longer about seeing Jushiro and Shunsui, for the memories having overcome would not strike twice. Zanjitsu, giving a comforting presence in the back of his mind, Ichigo pulled the door open and stepped inside, the warm atmosphere settling a little as the chill of oncoming night was leaked from his bones. Gazing around the room and trying to avoid the stare of a certain blonde-haired captain, Ichigo relented and turned, catching eyes with Shunsui and Jushiro. Painfully, Ichigo let his eyes drag toward Shinji, who was sprawled on one of the mats, a coy smirk on his face and hair of honey resting against his hips. Blood, gore, yellow eyes flashed across his sight. Shinji pushing him away as the Quincy that was self-detonating in the background laughed and mocked them chillingly. Shinji telling him to leave, to flee without him, as his injuries were already too great. Ichigo, tired from the battle and days of fighting, hadn't listened and began to sling his friend over shoulder, a litany of encouraging words spilling from his mouth in a rush. Shinji's wide eyes and soft hope as Ichigo stumbled away from the blood-soaked battleground. They had been so close, within reach of safety, when they had been ambushed. A single Quincy low of Reisu barely noticeable among wasteland of Soul Society. Shinji had pushed him out of the way, a spear piercing his abdomen as Zanjitsu flashed out in wicked bloodlust. He had caught Shinji and held him in his arms as blood stained his lips and his eyes seemed to lose the coy light that always shined in them. His voice was rough from yelling battle orders all day, and coughs gently disrupted his speech as he said, sorry Ichi, yeah we're right, I'm too old to be fighting in a war. At least I'll get to see the others again. Hey now, don't worry about me, don't give up, keep fighting. The cool hand that held his cheek as Ichigo stared on with wide eyes slowly fell limp to Shinji's side, and he let out a harsh, startling breath before his pulse fell still. Ichigo shook himself, startled, realizing his feet had led him close to the captains already. Shaking his head once more, Ichigo plastered a small smile on face, even though on the outside it felt like he was being run through with irons hot from the forge while buried under the crushing weight of snow. Are you alright, Ichigo? You look pale. Ichigo looked to Yukitake, whose kind words helped to dull the pain slightly before, with a nod of his head, he said, I'm fine now, my mind was dwelling on unpleasant thoughts. Have you seen Kyan? I am certain he went this way and yet I cannot trace it at this moment. Perhaps it is because of the overpowering power of captains. Shunsui laughed softly while Jushiro arched an amused eyebrow at Ichigo's teasing tone, a hint of concern still lying in caramel orbs. Shinji coughed slightly and turned to face Ichigo said, I'm Hirako Shinji, captain of Squad 5, I've heard many an exclamation of your name when Kaian is near. Ichigo nodded with a soft sigh, chills of unease tracing his spine as his eyes were drawn to a small oval window perched between the two senior captains. Shunsui seemed to notice the same as Jushiro, the paleness of his skin and the deep mauve under his eyes. His deep tenor was soft and comforting as he said, Ma Ichigo, you seem tired, why not stay for a while and rest? Ichigo smiled apologetically and rubbed the back of his neck softly and said, I can perhaps stay for a few, but Kaian must still serve his sentence and the thought of sleep calls temptingly to me. Good, sit. Heading Shunsui's happy order, Ichigo slid into the seat with a soft sigh, smiling softly at the thought of Kaian cowering under the table in fear. Shinji regarded the orangutan curiously before asking, what squad are ya planning on joining, Ichi? Any inclination to Squad 5 in particular? Ichigo laughed softly at Shinji's unsubtle hint at joining the 5th division before with slight mirth he replied, sorrowfully, it is not so, Hirako Teiko, my heart lies with the 8th, 6th, and 9th. Once a short time ago I considered the division, but to be truthfully your lieutenant and 3rd seat unsettle me. Hirako nodded slightly in understanding before turning to snap back at Shunsui, who was playfully taunting Hirako about the loss of such a promising Shinigami. A small yawn stretched Ichigo's face and the look that Jushiro shot him was clear enough. I'm afraid I shall retire, sleep calls me softly, whispering in my ear. Forgive me, gentlemen, perhaps I shall chance upon you again. If you see Kaian before I, warn him simply of his imminent doom at the hand of his executioner. Shunsui guffawed loudly, while Shinji chuckled and Jushiro smiled fondly as with his muscles aching in protest Ichigo pushed himself up. Shooting a heated glare at the table, Ichigo bowed and bade the captains good night before padding outside the warm restaurant, barely feeling the cold that swept through the streets in mighty gales. Taking a deep breath of the chill night air, Ichigo closed his eyes and let his mind mourn softly before with a snap of his eyes he was away. X. Chapter 7, Heimat. X. The normally welcoming Shiba mansion loomed ahead of Ichigo, candlelight flickering in curtained windows ominously. Ichigo sighed softly, doubt flickering to the forefront of his mind as he considered his plan of action. After insistent nagging on Kaian's part and the seed of guilt that wormed its way into his dreams, or rather nightmares, endlessly taunting and teasing him with their deaths, warping their faces and leaving an ache in his chest that lay with him all through the day, Ichigo decided that it was time he connected with the Shiba clan. In the past he hadn't spent nearly enough time with his family, and when they were cruelly ripped away from him, regret echoed endlessly in his head. The air was thick with a heavy tension. Tilting his chin upwards, Ichigo could see plumes of silver and amethyst twisting in an intimate battle that stretched across the early evening sky. A softer instinct, one less of battle and more of experience, whispered that no storm would be forthcoming this night, only the tenseness of a drawn-out stalemate that would break upon the morn. Shaking himself, he woefully acknowledged his procrastination and took a heavy step forward. Old man Zanjitsu whispered comfort to his hesitant mind while Shiro chuckled and in his harsh way teased Ichigo about going soft. He let his gratitude flow softly towards them before knocking on the wood frame of the elegant shoji doors. The sounds of feet scuttling about soon reached his ears and a large shadow graced the door. The door slid open with a soft hiss and revealed a flustered servant with tousled brown hair, a large frame, and coal eyes. Ashibadano, we weren't expecting you. Dinner is almost ready and Lady Kukeka was just descending to eat. Are you staying to eat? Ichigo's eyes widened slightly, startled at the warm welcome he received before he quickly recovered and said, I was hoping to stay if Kukeka doesn't mind. Shiro seemed to be laughing at Ichigo's sudden display of shyness. Usually the orange head would be blunt and at times rude, and so to see shyness was a rare thing indeed. Though it did make sense in that Ichigo was afraid of rejection, the thought of her cool disapproving eyes and venomous words chilled him more than any Quincy drabble. For what was he left with if the people he came to save viewed him as the monster? The servant nodded, a happy smile dancing on his face as he invited Ichigo and telling him to wander as he pleased, before the coal-eyed servant bustled off humming a cheery tune while an aura of contentment surrounded him. Ichigo gently toed his simple sandals off and peered at the decor. During his stay of more than a month he had been given a tour and shown the many walls that lined carpeted hallways. but he had never truly taken in the fine craftsmanship and detail inlaid in the very walls, as his mind had been fogged with the knowledge of the time he now resided in. Stepping forward, the tips of his lips quirked up as a warm and homey atmosphere descended on him, wrapping him up in a soft blanket of comfort. Unsure of what next to do, Ichigo followed Kukeiko's fiery Reisu, which boiled in her veins and lit up the house with crimson threads. She was descending the carved stairs when Ichigo found her, hair tied in a messy bun at the back of her head, a simple rose-colored kimono draped over her curvy form, and charcoal eyes full of blazing fire. Upon catching sight of Ichigo, she stomped over a frown marring her usually glowing face. Her hand was swiftly raised and Ichigo winced, preparing himself for the oncoming strike. Recoiling with the force of the blow, Ichigo gingerly rubbed his stinging cheek before looking up with humorous eyes and saying, "Nice to see you, Kukeiku." The ebony-haired woman smirked softly at the snark in his voice before pulling him into a tight hug that crushed the air from his lungs. Her words were a softy whisper upon his ear as she said, "Took you damn long enough, baka. I'm glad you're home." Ichigo smiled at the warm feeling that pulsed in his chest and caressed his cheeks, and his reply came out soft and slightly breathy. "It's wonderful to be home. Kukeiku smiled against Ichigo's shoulder before pulling away and studying the young academy student. His orange hair was still hanging down his back in a small ponytail that swayed slightly with his every move. His caramel eyes were alight with warmth and a soft love glimmered in them. Lavender bags still hung under his eyes and cast a slightly harrowing look to an already thin and chiseled face, and his lips were quirked up into a slight smile, so welcoming and open that Kukeiku couldn't help the smile that slipped onto her own face looking at him. Leading Ichigo towards the dining room, the two made idle talk, speaking of Ichigo's school and his studies, and in change Kukeiku's work on a new brand of fireworks. The air was filled with an aura of comfort as the two talked openly about this and that, Ichigo's shoulders losing the tense set to them that first greeted Kukeiku. "Kion won't be here for dinner, he's staying late to help Yuka take Teiko. I swear, that idiot brother of mine, but you already know that." Ichigo nodded to Kukeiku's inquiring looks as the two stepped into a smaller dining room meant for simple family meals and not extravagant balls that warranted over 5 tables. The Shibas were practical and understood the value of wealth. They choose not to display it in such a flamboyant manner, unlike other clans where the table stretched a long and narrow room, and the guest had the space of an elephant between them. Pulling herself from her thoughts, she heard Ichigo's deep and smooth voice say, "That's partially the reason I came this night. Better to have as little interaction as possible with that goof." Ichigo's words, if said in a different tone, might have seemed offensive, but they were said with good humor and a laugh upon his lips, and truly Kukeiku could understand where Ichigo was coming from. Kion was overprotective, it was quite simple, but he also was a Shiba, which led to a bit of an overbearing mix of protection and hyperactivity. As they stepped through a high arch into the dining room, the heady scent of food wafted towards their noses, and Ichigo let out a tiny sigh, amusement in her eyes and a smirk on her face. Kukeiku said, "Better than cafeteria food." Ichigo nodded with a smile on his face before glancing around the room curiously and asking, "Will Ganju be joining us?" Kukeiku laughed. It seemed Ichigo shared the Shiba trait overprotectiveness that or their inherent curiosity. "He should be. I know he was helping in the kitchen, but he also wanted to visit the nearby district for a little while. It's sweet really, he visits the children and gives them food if they hunger, and he always stays and talks to the elderly, listening to their tales of glory past." Ichigo chuckled softly for a moment before his eyes connected with Kukeiku's own curious ones. Rubbing his head sheepishly, Ichigo said, "It just seems like something Ganju would do. He wears his heart on his sleeve and optimism is his greatest weapon." Kukeiku only nodded and settled into one of the plush cushions placed beside the table. Ichigo sat across from her, leaving the position at the head of the table open as was customary. The food was quickly brought out on gleaming trays and settled before them, almost a small buffet with the many servings offered. Kukeiku glanced up to see Ichigo's dramatically wide eyes and slightly open mouth. The expression was quickly washed away and replaced with Ichigo's normal expression. One that wasn't menacing, nor happy, it was a blank expression, but some emotion slipped through in the crinkle of his eyes and the curve of his lips. "Whenever Ganju cooks, it's always a feast. This is why you should come home often. Mouth-watering food is always set at this table." Ichigo smiled slightly, chocolate eyes darkening briefly. A slight guilt colored his voice when he said, "I'm sorry for not visiting yet. My mind was cluttered and I needed time to settle. I hope to from now on visit regularly so I can better know the family that I share a last name with, though less of Kion is always fine." Kukeko laughed and reached across the table to gently grab Ichigo's hand, making sure her movements were clear before saying, "I understand change can be difficult. I'm just glad you finally decided to come home. And come now, Kion isn't that bad." "Oh wait, yes he is." They both broke into laughter at Kukeko's patronizing tone before beginning to dig into the delicious array of food laid out before them. Halfway through the meal, as Kukeko and Ichigo were discussing the Suteiko's majestic beard, Ganju entered, an apologetic smile on his face, and shock quickly dawning in his eyes when he saw Ichigo. "Kukeko-ne-san, I'm sorry I'm late. The children wanted to play extra long today, and Nakamura-san was telling me about her son who fought in a great war many years past, though she can't remember the name of it or the opposing sides." "Ichigo, I'm so glad you're here. Are you enjoying the food?" Kukeko laughed softly at Ganju's fast-paced talk and briefly glanced over to see Ichigo. Slightly surprised but mostly amused, he inclined his head slightly towards Kukeko, letting her know she could speak first. "It's fine, Ganju, just come sit down and enjoy the food. You can regale me with tales of your Rungokai adventures another time." Ganju smiled sheepishly before settling beside Kukeko so that he could face Ichigo when they spoke. "The food is excellent, thank you. 1,000 times better than the cafeteria food, which is alike in taste to swamp water." Ganju blushed slightly as Kukeko and Ichigo laughed slightly. It seemed that Ganju was doomed to always be the baby of the family, always receiving the brunt of the teasing, and the most attention. They continued to chat for a long while after the plates were cleared. Nursing steaming cups of teas in their hands, they traded stories of funny mishaps or outrageous events. As the night drew closer, a small yet deep smile settled on Ichigo's carved features, and in the forefront of his eyes happiness radiated much like the sun, but in those caramel orbs hidden carefully a glimmer of pain and sadness shone through, illuminating Ichigo's hidden emotions. Kukeko laughed a fair share that night and enjoyed the tales Ichigo told of friends unnamed, often enough reminding Kukeko of the many residents of Soul Society, and more than once the thought of sitting down with a good bottle of sake between the two and getting piss-drunk crossed her mind. As soft night surrounded them, Ganju sleepily rubbed his eyes before bidding them both good night. A quick peck on Kukeko's cheek and one of his bone-crushing hugs enveloped Ichigo. To see Ichigo's surprised eyes and slight smile before choking breath and slight pain overtook him would likely imprint itself in Kukeko's mind for a long while. Kukeko could feel sleep weighing her own eyes as Ganju padded up the stairs, leaving them creaking and groaning in their old age. "Are you staying the night, Ichi?" Kukeko questioned as she pushed herself from the soft pillow, stretching out slightly like a cat as she cast a curious glance to see Ichigo doing the same. His voice was slightly rough from the amount of talking that had traversed the night when he said, "I was hoping to, if that's okay. I doubt it would be the safest option to try and head to the academy dorms in this overwhelming darkness. Plus we have a day off tomorrow, something about a teacher's conference of something of the like." Kukeko nodded, amused by the sudden switch from shy and tender to teasing and brash that occurred when Ichigo was uncertain. The young man was definitely interesting by anyone's accounts. An enigma with so many quirks and turns that when one figured one part of the puzzle, three more revealed itself. At least that's what Kion compared Ichigo to with soft fondness. Padding towards the stairs, she turned and gestured for Ichigo to follow her. He nodded, orange hair swaying slightly before gliding after her, his footsteps a bare whisper on hardwood floors. Kukeko led him down the long hallway reserved for the inner circle of Shiba clan members, highly ornate with plush carpet and elegant prints scattered about, and stopped at the room designated for Ichigo. Pushing the door open, Kukeko smiled at Ichigo's shocked expression. The walls were painted a soft gray that faded into sudden stripes of sapphire and scarlet sparsely decorating the walls. The furniture was simple and carved of a rich ebony wood that glowed in soft candlelight. There was a collection of chairs with plush ruby pillows placed in one corner surrounding a deep fireplace, a desk with a large bookshelf filled to the brim with tomes of knowledge and history placed beside it. The bed frame was simple and elegant with vivid pictures of moonlit skies carved into the wood and soft curtains of slightly see-through white dangling around the frame. Two great windows stood at the end of the room, oval in shape with curtains of sable covering the pale crescent moon, and the floor of cherry wood was covered with a mat made of ivory, cotton and wool. Kion and I decided on the design of the room. Do you like it? Ichigo looked stunned, his eyes roving over the many aspects of the room. With Kukeko's voice he shook himself from his stupor and said, "Like it? It's amazing. I'm just having trouble believing Kion helped design it." Kukeko laughed before padding closer to Ichigo, and standing on the tips of her toes she placed a soft kiss on his head and whispered, "I'm glad you like it. Sweet dreams, Ichi." With those words she stepped back and passed through the door, leaving Ichigo to bask in his room as she headed the call of her own room, which her sleep-filled mind graciously responded to. Kion stepped into the Shiba mansion with a sigh, rubbing a tired hand over his eyes. The moon was already on its descent towards the end of night, letting his Reisu gently guide over the occupants of the household to make sure his family were safe. His eyebrows skyrocketed when he landed on the presence of a certain orange-haired student. Uncertain if his tired mind was playing tricks on him, Kion let his Reisu scan the mansion again to be certain. When it was confirmed, a soft smile danced across his face before a harsh frown descended upon noble features. He was exhilarated that Ichigo had finally come home, but he chose to do so when Kion wasn't home. Shaking his head softly, Kion wandered into the kitchen and to the counter where Kukeiku had left a small plate of leftovers resting with a cloth over them. Lifting it up to see the contents, Kion smiled, recognizing Ganju's cooking even in the darkness that surrounded him. Taking the plate with him, Kion gently climbed the stairs and walked down the hallway. Stopping at Ichigo's door, Kion paused a moment in consideration before shifting the door open and peering inside. A small candle was lit at the desk, the wax nearly burned down to a stub. Ichigo's vibrant hair was visible in the dim light slumped over the desk, a thick tome resting beside his head. Laughing softly, Kion placed the plate down and walked over to Ichigo. Arriving at the simple desk, Kion slipped his arms around his little brother and gently lifted him up, careful not to jostle him from sleep. Ichigo usually slept feather-light, the mere sound of a mouse scuttling across the floorboards waking him. But Kion knew Ichigo suffered from insomnia, unable to truly rest and suffering from vicious nightmares of a past untold. Sometimes when Ichigo refused to rest for days, it would creep upon him and wrap him in suffocating folds till he fell to her mercy. Placing Ichigo down on the cozy bed, Kion grabbed a soft throw and settled it around Ichigo's shoulder before gently brushing orange locks out of his face. A whispered good night leaving his lips as he turned and left. Picking his plate up on the way out, he stopped to blow out the candle covering the room in darkness. Mighty cloak. Ichigo woke slowly, the soft rays of sunlight hastening his awakening and letting eyelids flicker open to reveal misted chocolate orbs. Taking a moment, Ichigo swallowed, letting the horrors of night fade away and the ache that pounded in his chest soften. Groaning slightly, Ichigo pushed himself up from soft blankets which collected at his waist in a pile as his eyes glanced around the room, taking in the tome still open on his desk in a low candle stub where once a tallow candle stood tall. The book was ancient with brittle pages and a faded elegant script that sometimes disappeared altogether on thin yellow-stained pages. The contents of such writing were unknown, as even in the past when he first acquired the heavy tome he was unable to decode anything but for a scarce few words with Kisuke's help. What few words he did decode left a sense of danger and power echoing along his senses. Some unknown force compelled him to enter the small antiques store and seek the mysterious leather-bound book out once more. Now he was once again studying it. Shaking himself from musing thoughts, Ichigo set pale toes on the hardwood below and let out a hiss before recoiling. The floor was icy to the touch and Ichigo briefly mourned the lack of heating systems before braving the floor once more. As he slipped a simple pair of slippers on his feet, he glanced at the door in confusion. He did not make it to the bed last night if he remembered correctly. Surrendering to the beguiling sleep, Ichigo had slumped forward, resting his head on the desk below and let heavy eyelids slide close. Tracing his Reisu slightly over himself, he could feel Kion's soothing Reisu tickle slightly across his skin. Tilting his head to the side, Ichigo smiled softly before shaking his head and wandering to the desk to close the book and hide it out of sight. Coming down the stairs as early morning light brought the soft chirping of birds to his ears, Ichigo spotted Ganju sleepily rubbing his eyes and heading towards the kitchen. Smiling, Ichigo patted after Ganju before stopping beside him. It took Ganju a few moments to register the blazing presence beside him, but when recognition dawned in his eyes, Ichigo smiled and said, "My younger sister was the cook in our family, but I know a few great breakfast recipes if you are interested." Ganju seemed to recognize the hand for what it was, a tentative offer of kinship between them outstretched between the two. Ganju studied Ichigo for a moment before a smile befitting of the sun settled on his face and he nodded happily, momentarily striking Ichigo with the image of an even younger Ganju smiling. "Follow me. I bet you haven't seen our kitchens yet, they're spectacular." Ichigo winced slightly at the loud tones so early in the morning before a soft smile stole across his face and he followed Ganju, who was practically bouncing with every step. Ichigo settled onto the same cushion as last night, Kukeiku once more sitting opposite him and a beaming Ganju sitting beside his older sister. Curious glances were cast his way as the three waited for Kayan to grace them all with his presence so they might begin the meal. Truthfully, it was nothing of such courtesy, rather Ganju wanting everyone to try the new food he had cooked with Ichigo earlier in the morning. Kayan graced the scene much like Godzilla, seeming to stumble forward before plopping down with a rough sigh. Ichigo could sympathize. Coffee was a wonderful thing, but a lack of it in the morning led to the feeling much like a stone dropped into the ocean slowly drifting towards sand and seaweed below. A servant quickly bustled forward handing Kayan a steaming cup of tea which he took with a gracious smile and took a long sip of. As he placed the ceramic mug down, color slowly bled into his cheeks and his eyes seemed to regain the sparkle that was regularly present in his slate eyes. Nodding to the female servant hovering nearby awaiting Kayan's orders, she scurried into the kitchens to tell the others to bring out the steaming platters of hot food and sweet fruit. As the plates were set down, Kayan and Kukeiku cast glances at the wide selection of food unfamiliar to their eyes. Heavenly smells wafted from silver plates and steam curled softly in gentle spirals. Turning curious eyes toward Ganju, who was practically vibrating in his seat, so excited was he to share the food he had prepared for today's meal. It's Western food, Ichi taught it to me and showed me the recipes. He says there's plenty of interesting dishes prepared over there and he even offered to teach me other recipes. The appraising looks the older Shiba siblings cast him brought a slight blush to his cheeks. It was easy to learn such dishes when one is stationed there for a few months. During the war, news reached them of Bach trying to form a base of power in America. There was a lull, less fighting, and time to breathe if only a little, so Ichigo was sent to America and Canada for a week or two, with only Chad at his side. As the Quincy's are human in a sense, Ichigo and Chad were able to walk around the streets in their own bodies of flesh and feel blood pumping hot in their veins. As the food was heaped onto clean ceramic plates, Ichigo let out a pleased hum as the familiar taste of waffles danced across his tongue. Across from his Kukeiku hesitantly stared at the food below before trying some and letting out a surprised sound of delight. Wow, this tastes excellent. Kayan as exuberant as ever with his buoyant exclamation as food rapidly disappeared inside the tunnel that served as his mouth. Ichigo could only shake his head with a soft smile before sharing a pleased look with Ganju. Just what we expect from the babies of the family. Ichigo spluttered at Kukeiku's joking words, wide eyes landing on her devilish smirk. Ganju let out a soft groan, a pout settling on soft features before he petulantly said, Kukeiku-ne-san. How many times do I have to tell you not to call me that? Isshinji already has too many nicknames for me. Besides, you don't even know Ichi's age, he could be older than all of us. Ganju's statement sent a ripple of laughter through the table before the end of his words hit them and they cast curious glances at Ichigo. Kayan seemed slightly worried at the thought of Ichigo being older than him. Well, how old are you, Ichi? When Anohana Teiko was healing you she did a full body scan, but she couldn't discern your age, and when's your birthday? Ichigo had to stop for a moment and really think about his age. He was 15 when the Winter War first started and it lasted 3 years, so he was 18 by the time it ended. The 1,000-year Blood War lasted 10 years, so he would be 28 when it ended. He even remembered celebrating his 25th birthday with the others. He got completely hammered that night. Yet his body had passed in the human world around his 22nd birthday, and that was the age he appeared. But he couldn't tell them he was 28, soon to be 29. He'd be regarded as a child, unfit to serve in a squad, and there would be questions about his appearance. It seemed like he once again had to lie. One after the other, small, insignificant, and ginormous, over and over again like grains of sand slowly piling onto his shoulders. Eventually he would suffocate in them. My age? I'm roughly 200. My birthday is August 15th, but I usually prefer not to celebrate it. Kayan smirked, obviously pleased that Ichigo wasn't older than him, but darkness flashed in his eyes as he comprehended the last part of Ichigo's speech. Kukeiku seemed to catch on Ichigo's meaning as well and shared a quick glance with Kayan, a small frown resting on her face that passed in an instant. See, Ganju, Ichigo is older than you, if only by a few years. Kukeiku said, consoling Ganju slightly before Kayan jumped in and said, more like 40. Ganju frowned and shot a glare at his brother as Ichigo laughed softly in the background. He missed such sibling antics as these, mornings filled with flagrant bickering and wailing in the background as sweet aromas drifted around them. The thought brought darkness to his eyes and weighed on his heart, and only old man Zanjitsu's warm presence at his back jolted him from the dangerous funk he could still feel his heart setting into. Looking up, Ichigo could see his family now, Ganju under Kyan's arm as harsh knuckles dug into his head, Kukeiko laughing in the background, and smiles playing across their faces. This is what he had to focus on, the here and the now. X. Yorichi nodded to the two Shiba guards as she pranced up the Shiba mansion, short plum-colored hair and a soft cream-colored scarf flowing behind her. She was far too busy nowadays, she thought a touch morosely to herself, what with keeping an eye on Kisuke, the lovable genius who was a slight bit crazy in hiring the creepy fellow with face paint, looking after her new lieutenant, who was far too adoring, listening to Yorichi's every command, and trying to find time to tease Byakuya. It was quite a mess to find time to see her favorite Shiba princess. Raising a poised hand, Yorichi knocked on the thin wooden frame, butterscotch eyes glowing slightly in excitement. A slightly flustered Kukeiko opened the door, letting Yorichi slip inside as she said, I'm sorry, I completely forgot today was our day. You see, my little brother, the one who's attending the academy, finally came home yesterday and we were just spending some time talking, it completely slipped my mind. Yorichi laughed, ivory teeth flashing slightly as she placed a reassuring hand on Kukeiko's bony shoulder, a slight touch of interest in her voice. Yorichi said, it's fine, don't worry about it, besides I think I want to meet this little brother of yours. Byakuya has been talking about him a lot, and new material to tease that Kukeki with is always great. Kukeiko laughed at the seemingly inside joke and led Yorichi towards one of the smaller, more personal sitting rooms. Sliding the door open, Yorichi was greeted with flaming orange hair and a lean body sprawled over one of the many chairs gathered about a low table. Looking up, seemingly startled, Ichigo, for Yorichi presumed this was the academy student, glanced first at Kukeiko and then let his eyes lazily glide to land on Yorichi. Pain seemed to flash lightning quick in those eyes, his body tensing almost unnoticeably before slipping once more into a relaxed position. His chocolate eyes seemed to be focused on nothing as he shifted into a slightly more seated position. Yorichi cast a glance to Kukeiko to see worry slipping across her face before peeling away, leaving a slightly forced smile. Ichigo, I doubt you two have met. This is Yorichi Shihoin, head of the Shihoin house and captain of the 2nd division. Yorichi, this is my brother Ichigo Shiba, who is studying alongside Byakuya at the academy. Ichigo stood up with the grace of a cat and the silence of a mouse, raising a curious eyebrow as Yorichi regarded him. The corners of his lips turned up slightly as he offered his hand, smiling in turn. Yorichi took the calloused hand with her own daintier one. Yorichi's eyes widened at the feel of Ichigo's unique reisu that prickled under her skin. It was cool fire, light night, mercy, and determination. It's a pleasure to meet you. Ichigo's voice was rich with a smoothness to it that was pleasant on the ears. Yorichi smiled, her eyes traveling up and down his body appreciatively before replying, indeed, the pleasure is mine. Yorichi smirked internally at the slight dusting of rose that danced across pale cheeks. Ichigo would definitely be fun to tease. Kukeiko laughed and separated them, pulling the small triad towards plush chairs. In an interesting afternoon. So what were you and Ichigo discussing before I arrived? The way Yorichi said the sentence caused Kukeiko to snort slightly before casting an amused glance in Ichigo's direction. The orangutan was firmly glancing out the window, avoiding the eyes of the beautiful women in front of him. We were discussing gossip. It's quite funny, Ichigo has a unique habit of eavesdropping on whoever he's passing by, taking whatever gibberish they've said and pulling the real meaning out of it. What self-respecting noble wouldn't want to hear the interesting tidbits of information? Yorichi could see Scarlet spring to life once more as Ichigo looked up with a sigh and a resigned look at Kukeiko's words. Laughing softly, Yorichi regarded the student with an interested eye. Really? What an interesting habit, care to share some more, Ichigo? Ichigo turned towards the two ladies with a slightly worried cast to his eyes. He obviously recognized those hungered stares and devilish smirks that settled on Yorichi and Kukeiko's faces and said, I'm not going to escape this, am I? The two ladies shared twin looks full of devil's fire before turning back to Ichigo and shaking their heads in unison. And really, what did Ichigo expect when Kukeiko and Yorichi were gathered together? X. Byakuya followed the mousy servant through pale walls that shined golden in the sun, and highlighted polished wood below. A slight shiver crossed his spine as his eyes glanced around. He would have preferred to stay away from the Shiba mansion and trained at the academy, but it seemed Ichigo was content to stay at the Shiba mansion and spend time with his family, and as the instructor, or rather torturer, made the decisions. The female servant pointed towards a thin shoji door where a slip of emerald peeked through and the light was brightly shining on simple walls. Shibadano is outside, see call if you need assistance. With those parting words the servant scurried off, leaving Byakuya to stare pensively at the soft sunlight battering against a thin paper frame. Sighing, Byakuya pushed aside the frame and stepped onto lush grass. A quiet wind blew through ebony locks, the gentle rustle of the leaves accompanying the sweet breeze. Letting his eyes scan the quaint backyard, Byakuya could see a large oak tree standing watch. A small well was set in the corner under the shade of a curling elm tree, and a large assortment of colored flowers bloomed pleasantly throughout. Sweeping his eyes once more, Byakuya landed on a shock or orange hair vibrant against the mellow greens of the grass. Silently Byakuya crept towards the figure splayed in the grass, chest moving in a peaceful rise and fall. Ichigo's chocolate eyes were vacantly staring at the crystal sky above, his hands rested loosely at his sides. Looking into Ichigo's eyes, Byakuya swore he could see the stars hidden far above reflecting in them, such depth hidden in eyes so layered with emotion. "So senpai, are we going to start training?" The peaceful moment was brutally disrupted as Ichigo blinked before knocking Byakuya over and pining him to the ground. Looking up, Byakuya could see an amused smile playing on Ichigo's face as his voice rang out slightly irritated. "How many times do I have to tell you not to call me senpai?" Byakuya smirked at his friend, eyebrows raised challenging. "You know what? Fine, we're going to spar today." Horror flashed across Byakuya's face at those words, words of doom. For Ichigo would not go easy on Byakuya, and he would likely come home covered in a multitude of bruises in varying shades of mauve, juniper, sickly yellow, and crimson. Determination shone in Ichigo's eyes as he rolled off of Byakuya and dusted his spruce-colored pants off. Byakuya let out a soft sigh before drawing his Zanpakuto and standing up. Ichigo nodded, the corners of his lips turning up faintly in approval. The two backed away from each other, blades held at the ready before an unspoken whisper sounded, and they began. Byakuya brought his blade overhead as he stepped forward before quickly bringing the blade down to the side and thrusting from that angle. He could feel his presence guiding his arm and infusing it with strength as he brought it up hastily to block a harsh strike from the side. Letting his instincts drive him, he followed the flow and gracefully brought his arm up and with a flick blocked the back thrust with ease. Ichigo's style was controlled strength and speed, a graceful dance far outstripping his own. There was no flamboyance in Ichigo's moves, only the call of his Zanpakuto and his instincts carving a path for heady strength and nimble solace. Back and forth they clashed, bright gleams of silver flashing in the midday sun. Perspiration beaded on Byakuya's forehead and his breath escaped him in rough gasps as he swung his blade again. Ichigo looked wholly unaffected, the rare bead of sweat rolling down carved features to drip from an angled chin. His blade was sure and strong as he defended Byakuya's clumsy strikes. With a flick of his wrist the sword was sent flying, landing with a loud clang in soft ground beyond. Again. That was the only word Ichigo uttered, but Byakuya could see the fierce pride that shined in caramel orbs. Byakuya paused for a moment, taking in deep breaths and letting his mind and heart settle in their racing before striding over and picking up the heavy metal with a flourish. Turning to Ichigo, he let a determined smirk grace his face as he sank into position. Ichigo laughed, an approving light in his eyes as he mirrored Byakuya. Basil vines dangled above them, letting a soft shade cover heated brows and cool misted eyes. Side by side Byakuya and Ichigo lay under a great willow tree with drooping branched and cluttered leaves. Turning to Ichigo with a curious cast to his eyes, Byakuya asked, "Did Kaion-san tell you about the Matsuri celebration being hosted by the Kukaki family in a few weeks?" Ichigo let out a snort followed by a tired hand rubbing his forehead. His voice was vaguely patronizing with knowing tones hidden underneath as he said, "Of course he didn't tell me this is Kaion we're talking about. I'll keep it in my mind, though I doubt the experience will be pleasurable. Gatherings of this kind are simply a waste to attend." "I can agree, but at least we will have each other to satisfy night's boredom." Ichigo laughed slightly at Byakuya's words, raising his head on a raised palm and casting fond eyes in his direction. Byakuya paused, wondering whether to let the question that plagued his mind slip free from his grasp and dance across his tongue. "Ichigo, I know some secret lies deep within you. I'm not asking you to tell me. I don't want you to tell me unless you're ready. I just want to know if there will ever be a time where you will trust me with these words hidden in your eyes." Ichigo's eyes widened and silence reigned between the two as Ichigo turned onto his back once more, a puff of breath escaping his lips before he said, "One day you will learn the truth of my sorrow, and when that day comes your shoulders shall be the heavier for it. Know this though, that I trust you, now more than ever, and with that trust come the promise of truth." Byakuya nodded, a small smile slipping across his face as he gazed at the sky above through tangled vines. Rich shades of lilac, gold, rose, and cerulean danced across the sky in a magnificent sunset, leaving a deep-seated sense of awe echoing in Byakuya's soul. X. A headache pounded in his temple as Kion shuffled through the Shiba mansion doors. The day had been long, and though Kion loved what he did, he couldn't help the ache and tire that plagued his body. Sentaro was barely experienced, and whenever Yuka so much as coughed he rushed to his aid, dropping stacks of paperwork. In addition to that chaos, Yuka had another attack, rendering him weak and Kion plagued with worry. There was still far too many piles of paperwork to complete, and Kion could feel the weight unconsciously put on his shoulders pulling him down. Sighing softly, he shook himself from morose thoughts and crept upstairs, mindful of the slumbering occupants. As was his tradition, Kion let his Reisu sweep over the walls, gently tracing the Reisu of his family, assuring Kion of their presence. Satisfied that everyone rested safely, Kion paused to wonder if Ishine, their uncle who should have held the position of head of the family, would come home one night. The animatic captain preferred to hike through Rungokai and rest in one of the many Shiba houses placed throughout. Ishine valued family, but even more so solitude sought him out like a dog to a scent. Kion wouldn't have noticed anything as he walked past Ichigo's closed doors if not for the loud noise that swept away his thoughts and made his hair stand on end. All the problems running through his mind disappeared as he whipped around to stare at the shoji door. Putting his hand cautiously against the wood, Kion recoiled as potent Reisu seemed to simmer underneath his hand. Closing his eye, Kion let his Reisu trace the thick presence in front of the door. He let out a shocked breath at what he saw. Glimmering threads of onyx and pearl interwoven irrevocably tight surrounded Ichigo's room. The purpose of such threads was vague, and Kion wondered at such strong bonds. To keep noise out? To keep Reisu in? In any case, the Kido that shone slightly in the dim light of oil lamps was far above the level of any academy student, and perhaps even those of captain level. Another pained sound graced his ears, and Kion's mind picked up pace, racing to find a way to enter the room. Willing to try anything, Kion put his hand against the barrier and let his Reisu mimic Ichigo's own. A true replica was impossible, so Kion summarized the feel and thoughts that swirled in Ichigo's own soul. The barrier shuddered as if trying to make a decision before flickering briefly and letting Kion's hand slip through. Breathing deeply, Kion slid open the thin frame and stepped through the wall of energy and into Ichigo's room. The curtains were flung open, casting moonlight shadows upon the furniture and illuminating the disarray of the room. Ichigo's shiakusho was scattered about along with thin transcripts of rice paper covered in elegant swirls and peculiar drawings of unidentifiable shapes. Kion's wandering eyes were drawn to the bed when a soft moan echoed in the empty room. Quickly traversing the distance, Kion stopped beside the bed and threw aside thin curtains shading his view of Ichigo. Orange hair painted the pillows in soaked strands, a flush stained pale skin, and Ichigo's chest rose rapidly as if he couldn't get enough air into his lungs. His arms were sprawled haphazardly and rapidly as he tossed back and forth. Kion's mind seemed to empty at the sight before him, unable to comprehend the image of his baby brother in front of him. Nijibana whispered softly in his mind, and he shook himself. Kneeling on the bed beside Ichigo, Kion could see Ichigo's lips move in a rapid mantra, the same sentences and words repeating in a broken and breathy whisper. "Sorry. I'm sorry, please forgive me. No. Don't leave. I don't want to be alone again." The plea left Kion breathless, his heart pounding in his ears and a gasp escaping his lips. Reaching down, he gingerly pulled Ichigo to his chest and hugged the thin orangutan close. "Ichi, hey, wake up. It's okay, I'm here, you're not alone." Kion's voice was soft as he gently rocked the two back and forth. Ichigo continued to struggle in his arms, choked breaths escaping him. Kion continued his mantra, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Slowly Ichigo's eyelids blinked open, fogged with confusion, and he said, "K Kion." Kion's smile was watery as he brushed tangled locks from Ichigo's forehead and nodded him, assuring Ichigo of his presence with a warm Reisu. Ichigo seemed to choke his breath coming out quickly as his eyes blinked rapidly and he began to tremor in his arms. Eyes widening, Kion pulled Ichigo up slightly into a seating position where he could look Ichigo in the eyes. Hey, you're okay. Just breathe with me, okay?" Ichigo grasped onto Kion's robes of ice-lock grip, chocolate eyes locked onto flint eyes, and some recognition shone through a panicked haze. "That's it, just follow me, in and out, nice and slow." Together their breaths were the only sound to disturb the sound of night's silence. Kion didn't know how long they sat there under the cover of moonlight, Ichigo's breath slowing and regaining control at a steady pace. Reisu coiled about them, speaking of warmth and peace. Kyan had the faint notion of it being his own, and yet other presences resided within the calm aura. Thank you, Kyan. The words were barely above a whisper and Kyan strained to hear them. Turning to Ichigo with a small smile, Kyan nodded, and that was all that was needed. Sleep came with soft touch, striking them slowly. Unaware of its spell, Kyan watched as chocolate orbs were covered. The weight on his own eyelids became too much and he let them slide close with a quiet breath. X. Chapter 8, No Sewer. X. Ichigo stared at the swirling liquid below him, pale rose in color. Steam drifted upwards in gentle spirals. Letting out a soft sigh, Ichigo tipped the ceramic mug back and took a sip of the sweet chai tea. Flicking his eyes upwards, he could see Kukeko staring with an amused look, shaped eyebrows raised and curiosity lacing slate eyes. Setting the mug on the oak table below, Ichigo frowned slightly before saying, "Are you sure I have to go?" Kukeko laughed, a smile gracing her elegant features. Shaking her head in light amusement, she replied, "I see now, you didn't want to come and have tea with your nice and beautiful older sister. You just wanted to complain about the party." Her smooth voice took on a false tone of hurt and crocodile tears seemed on the verge of cascading down her pale cheeks. Ichigo shuffled in the plush chair, feeling slightly guilty, but knowing Kukeko's nature she understood all too well why he was there. "That's not entirely true. Can your studious younger brother take time out of his woeful schedule to grace his beautiful sister's visage?" Kukeko's laughter bounced around the room, a clear ringing sound that tipped the curve of Ichigo's lips upward. Waving her hand once she regained control, Kukeko nodded and said, "Say what you will, you're just as sly as Kyan when he's about to go hunt for girls. Seriously, don't worry about the party, it'll be fine. You may not have a stick up your ass, but you can blend in well enough." Ichigo stared at her incredulously before she continued, "Don't give me that look. I've seen you talking to the elders, even if you totally shut them down without their knowledge." They both shared a knowing smile. When Ichigo was first inducted into the clan, the elders tried to kick up a fuss stating the lack of Shiba blood. Anohana had swept in with a smile that would frighten Hades and showed them the blood samples she took and the correlation between them and Shiba blood. Ichigo suspected the reasoning behind such plotting laid mainly in the scars covering his torso, a clear mark of trauma. Even now as he passed through brick-lined streets, the onyx-haired captain would send a calculating and concerned gaze his way. The elders were not wise in their age but rather senile, and they thought it a great idea to bring Ichigo, who still swayed on his feet with exhaustion at the time, in front of them. It was like the Spanish Inquisition, except Ichigo expected it, or something of that sort. They quizzed him endlessly, trying to pry any information they could get frail-veined hands on. Ichigo responded in kind with vague answers and blank smiles. The head of the elders soon was fed up with the direction the meeting was heading and so began to insult Ichigo. Perhaps to test him? Lazily Ichigo's words flowed like honey, but underneath hid the venom of a cobra. Letting his musings drift away, Ichigo glanced up to see Kukeko gazing vacantly out one of the oval windows that framed mint-colored walls. Ichigo took in a breath, letting the non-existent weight, a self-imposed weight, settle. "Come now, Ichigo, cheer up. At least you have a comrade with which you can survive the night. Remember that party hosted last spring. Underneath that emotionless mask of yours, you were a fish floating in the middle of a new ocean where sharks fed freely on all. Now you are far greater than any old shark I have encountered." Ichigo nodded, a soft smile playing on his face at her kind words. A yawn shook his frame slightly and he said, "I wish what you said were so easy. No, it is far more likely that the punch bowl be my ally. As the Kukeki family is the gracious host, he shall be running around and greeting guests much like a headless chicken." Kukeko laughed and said, "You always have the weirdest comparisons, Ichi. If it bothers you that much, you can always bring a book and sneak into the gardens." Ichigo's hazel eyes visibly brightened at the idea and he smirked at the idea, thanking Kukeko. She only smiled a knowing smile before leaning in conspiratorially and saying, "You're not the only one who finds noble affairs boring, Ichi. I once found Jinrei Kukeki making origami under the table at a dinner." Ichigo's eyebrows lifted and a small laugh escaped his lips. It seemed that Byakuya learned that habit from his grandfather. Ichigo could with fond ease draw up many memories of the two hunched beneath smoking crimson-stained rubble and debris, Byakuya's hands moving in intricate patterns to reveal delicate birds and fragile flowers. Arching an eyebrow, Ichigo leaned in to meet Kukeko halfway and glanced at the door before whispering, "If you think that's stunning, you won't believe what I caught the Suteiko doing one time." Interest gleamed in their eyes and Ichigo's heart ached softly at the image the two presented in his mind's eye. When Orium had learned of his habit, she began to drag him to any restaurant nearby when the thought struck her and demand the latest feed. In return her silver eyes glowed and she babbled about the latest recipe, and Uriah's blindness to any attempts, because really when she practically said the words he stared at her blankly, the light reflecting off his glasses. Taking the cup into his hands once more, Ichigo smiled into his tea and listened as Kukeku began to tell him of the time Kaian forgot to brush his hair. If they shared any similarity it was their hair, and Ichigo could only wince at the idea of untamable hair left to run wild. Steam curled around Ichigo's form as hot water lapped against his sides. A blissful sigh escaped parted lips as the tension strung into his muscles bled out, leaving the feeling of melting butter. Ichigo would have to thank Ganju for suggesting using the hot springs located in one of their winter lodgings. After talking with Kukeku for over an hour, Ganju had peered in around the frame like a nervous child and tenderly asked if Ichigo would like to accompany him on his journey to Rungokai. His agreement slipped from his lips unbidden, and Kukeku stared at Ichigo for a moment in contemplation before her shoulders slumped fractionally and she nodded, a gentle and approving smile resting on her face. She made him promise to regale her with tales before sending the two on their merry way. Ichigo had been pleasantly surprised as he watched Ganju flicker from person to person, sharing kind words, good food, and gentle advice. Children looked upon him with adoring eyes and sweet smiles, and adults who usually held guarded coldness in their eyes let fondness glimmer at the peaceful sight. Ichigo listened intently as Ganju talked to the many elders who sat in noonday sun, letting pleasant breeze ruffle ivory hair. It was easy to see why the Shibas of any noble family were the most respected among residents of Rungokai. It also explained the ease in which the Shiba line vanished from the sight of Soul Society, traitorous names hanging above their heads with the fell swoop of the pendulum. Light as a feather, a soft presence danced on the edge of his senses, resting outside the thin shoji doors. Opening his eyes, Ichigo stared at the door and watched as it slowly slid open to reveal a cat of speckled white fur with handsome honey-colored eyes. Smiling, Ichigo beckoned the cat further in, watching its tail curl and sway while intelligent golden eyes blinked in curiosity. Ichigo laughed softly so as not to startle the cat before saying, "You remind me of the cat my sister brought home once, though it turned out to a panther, of sorts. Who eventually revealed himself to be a teal-haired Arrancar. That was a fun day." Ichigo smiled fondly at the memory and the alliance his arrival brought, an alliance that survived 2 wars. Ichigo was pleased that his heart was not laden with heavy darkness, and only a dull ache in his heart and sharpness in his hands reminded him of all that had come to pass. What once started as a rivalry bloomed into a friendship that fueled their determination to fight all the more so. Looking at the cat, Ichigo tipped his head back with a sigh before his silky voice lifted through the air. "Of course I'm talking to a cat, again." The feline let out an indignant meow and Ichigo stared ruefully for a moment before shaking his head. Such feisty and temperamental creatures, and yet undeniably endearing. Ichigo sat in front of a mirror with a faint irritated look. Of course Kukeku deemed that Ichigo must dress up properly, which in turn meant layers of clothing, elegant brooches, and shoes that dug into your heels all night. Rummaging around in the simple walk-in closet located in his room, Ichigo let his eye cast over the many garments of vibrant colors hanging in neat identical rows. A flash of indigo caught his eyes and he stepped forward to nag the piece of clothing. It was simple in design, a pale midnight blue that seemed to shimmer in soft light, stars curled in gentle spirals that appeared like the cluster of a galaxy from afar. The obi was a pale white contrasting sharply against the darker blue. Beads of onyx and light iron were woven into the fabric in sweeping chains. A simple haori was left over the hook. It was loose and untraditionally long, almost sweeping the floor. Its color was like that of the clouds in spring, shades of gray blending into one another in quick transitions of light to dark. Nodding his head, Ichigo took on the long and trying process of putting on the elegant yukata. Finally cloaked in soft fabric that swirled around his feet with every step, Ichigo padded towards the mirror and observed the sweeping lengths and sweet colors. Reaching up to run calloused fingers through thick locks, Ichigo glanced at the vanity below the mirror. Spotting a simple clasp with sapphires increased instead sparsely, Ichigo strung his hair into a high ponytail and let the clasp grasp the hair in a tight lock. Glancing around the room searching for the last elusive piece to the outfit he had pieced together, and really when had he begun to care of his looks, he suspected Uriah in the matter. Ichigo's eyes alighted on a pale white scarf. When they had found him lying in a crater of carved rock, it had still been wrapped around his neck as if unable to let go of its wielder, a keepsake from Rukia and Byakuya, a symbol of their everlasting friendship. The scarf still graced his neck often, but even now the slightest fabric could sometimes leave the feel of large hands grasping and choking the life out of him. Wrapping the scarf around a pale neck, Ichigo let the ends gently flutter to rest behind him before stepping out of his room and into the hallway. Kukeiku was waiting, leaning in a relaxed position against the opposite wall. A coy smile danced across her face as her eyes traveled up and down, surveying Ichigo's change of clothing. "My! You sure clean up nicely, Ichi." Ichigo smiled, letting his own eyes observe the beautiful kimono of pale gold and sweet rouge that graced Kukeiku's figure. Her hair was strung up in an elegant bun with spirals of raven hair framing her angular face. "I could say the same of you, your eyes sparkle and you look simply ravishing." Pale rose painted her cheeks and a pleased smile graced her lips as she playful swatted at Ichigo before turning and gesturing for him to follow her. Shaking his head in amusement, Ichigo prayed to whatever deity above that might be listening that the party wouldn't be an event of such unforgettable proportions. The chatter that permeated every room of the Kukeki mansion was the first sound that greeted Kyan's ears other than the gently chitter of night's creatures. Casting his eyes to the side, Kyan's lips quirked upwards as he spotted the small frown hidden under a pleasant expression firmly settled on Ichigo's noble features. "Cheer up, brother of mine, this night will soon be over, and I have a few bottles of prime sake stored at home." Ichigo's incredulous look brought great amusement to Kyan, who snorted slightly at the look before stepping forward. A Kukeki servant hurried to greet them, soot-colored hair messed like a bird's nest and lilac eyes peeking from underneath. Smiling, Kyan nodded, showing her the invitation, and she squeaked before leading them further inside the mansion. Ichigo paused at the door, a strange touch of longing in his eyes as he stared at the horizon where the cover of night was descending in pale hues of juniper and cerulean. Ichigo turned away abruptly and followed Kyan inside. A night of flagrant flamboyance awaited them. Kyan, with Kukeiku in tow, bustled from noble to noble, greeting them with fake, pleased smiles and firm handshakes. Idle conversation was made in quick passing before Kyan was handed off to another to introduce Ichigo, who hovered behind Kyan much like a specter, piercing eyes casting about the crowds searching for a certain Kukeki noble. Kyan was swept deeper into the crowd, Reisu pressing irritatingly on his senses from all sides as servants swept across the floor carrying trays laden with thin glasses and delectable treats. A flowered and faintly familiar presence sparked Kyan's senses, and he turned to see Kukeki Jinrei standing among the crowd. Turning to glance at Ichigo, Kyan noticed that Kukeiku had already ambled away, probably to flirt with one of the many suitors present. Ganja was lucky that he could claim a lack of age and experience. Right now he was likely cooking up a storm in the kitchen, that or his weird habit of trying to tame the local hogs. Ichigo's chocolate eyes flashed his acknowledgement, and Kyan sashayed towards Kukeki Taiko, whose intimidating height wasn't bothering Kyan at all. "Nope, not at all. Shiba-san, a pleasure to see you here." Kukeki Taiko's voice was lightly grating and rusted with age, yet it still held the commanding baritone and majestic undertones of his position. Kyan inclined his head in what would pass as respectful enough. Kukeki-san glanced around as if to see the rest of Kyan's entourage before his eyes alighted on Ichigo, who was hard to miss in the eye-catching attire he wore. "Indeed, the pleasure is all mine. This is my younger brother Ichigo, who I do not think you have yet met, though I am sure you have heard something of him from your grandson." Kyan silently choked on his own pompous words, and as he spoke simple pleasantries, behind him Kyan could sense good-natured humor and a slight weariness flowing along the current of Ichigo's Reisu. Kukeki-san seemed to smile in a slightly pained manner before extending a hand to shake. Ichigo stepped forward, gripping the elderly captain's hand firmly. "Gratuitous fortune that I am finally able to meet the Shiba my young nephew speaks so often of." Ichigo blushed slightly at those words before he regained control and smiled. "The perfect image of a noble," he said. "It is kind to hear that Byakuya speaks such words in your presence. Truly it is an honor to meet the figure who stands so wisely, a mentor in Byakuya's life." Kukeki-san seemed surprised to hear Ichigo's flowery tone and deep voice. Kukeki-san opened his mouth as if to respond in kind when Byakuya graced the scene, bedecked in a yukata of Arctic blue, patterned with soft sakura petals of pale rose. His obi creamy gold, and the haori that blanketed his shoulders was a turquoise in color that rippled around his lithe form. He turned to speak to his grandfather before his eyes alighted on Ichigo, poised in the picture of nobility. The young man hid amusement under a fragile mask and leaned to whisper careful words in Kukeki-san's ear. Turning away from his grandfather, Byakuya bowed his head, a pleasant smile on his face as he said, "Greetings Lord Shiba, a fine night it is that you have graced us with your presence. And to you Ichigo of the Shiba clan I bid good evening." It was as if some unknown challenge had been initiated between the two students. Playful fire danced within their eyes and a smirk seemed to dance on Ichigo's face fleetingly. Before Kyan could respond to the words of song, Ichigo rose to the challenge, his voice a sweet crescendo as he said, "My greetings to you Byakuya of House Kukaki. This night does indeed speak of finesse, for what other reason may the stars shine so bright in their high seats of heaven? The scent of sakura and fall hangs heavy on the air, bringing saccharine tidings. We have spoken too hastily I fear, let us depart so that those of wiser stature may conference without the impudent thoughts of the young." Kyan deemed those words a win on Ichigo's part as the two shared a look before glancing to their elders, surprising Kyan. Kukaki-san laughed in slight amusement before nodding. Ichigo and Byakuya flashed away, leaving the two Shinigami to dwell on the frivolous passing of their kin. "You were correct in assuming that I had not met Ichigo until this evening. Now I can see how unlike any Shiba, any soul he truly is. It is no wonder Byakuya had found confidence in he who bears orange hair." Kyan nodded, staring at the arch where the two had traipsed off to. Kukeiko's energetic presence, which coiled under her skin, sidled up to Kyan and she spoke soft words of greeting to the ivory-haired man in front of them. "It is not only your nephew that had benefited from their relationship." Ichigo's eyes sparkle fervently when he dwells with Byakuya. To see him laugh is too rare a sight. Meaningful glances were exchanged, words not easily spoken between a noble of high house and cordial tongue, and a noble of blistering kindness and soft fire. The night air cut swiftly into Ichigo's lungs as they stepped out into a small side garden, where bushes and lunging trees crouched on a compact space of pleasant emerald, and a lone stone bench illuminated by the warm lights from within and the rising moon stood. Slipping out of plain sandals, Ichigo let lush grass brush his feet as he wandered further into the garden, Byakuya a pace behind him. The slight pain at the base of his head grew noticeable in the silence, and with a smile of satisfaction Ichigo reached up and unclasped the sapphire brooch that kept orange locks so firmly in place. An evening breeze rustled his locks so they danced across his sight and whispered against his neck. Byakuya's quiet chuckle of amusement reached Ichigo's ears and he turned away, the luminous moon gilding his back in soft rays. Silence blanketed the garden, only the gentle hum of water flowing and night's small wonders buzzing about filled the silence. Gesturing with his hands, Ichigo settled on the stone bench below. A slight chill seeped from cool marble and left a soft chill in his core. Byakuya shook his head, whether in amusement or ire of Ichigo's actions was unforeseen, and perched on the bench, ebony locks shadowing his eyes for a fraction of a second. "What do you seek with the passing of this night?" The question was thrust forth from a weary mind, and Ichigo turned to regard Byakuya, inquisitively gazing above at the celestial beings of light dust. Ichigo's reply was hushed in the intimacy of night, and a kind fondness seeped into words of intricacy. "Life perhaps? No longer do I focus on one goal to sustain me, no, I must focus on moving forward. If I hesitate, the sands of time shall swallow me up in a nameless grave. Maybe that is a truer purpose of a friend, to hold you at a distance or close embrace with a rope of memories and pull you from the ever-quicksand. You're waxing metaphors and poetically again, my friend. I have no doubt that if I asked you of tea you would reply along the lines of, like tea humans are, we are water that is steeped with knowledge, the longer we wait the richer the taste. Or something to that effect." Ichigo laughed, the clear sound ringing around the garden and causing Byakuya to glance over before his own mirth bubbled from his lips so that they formed a duet of humor. Calming himself with deep breaths, Ichigo smiled at Byakuya, his cheeks painted a faded rouge in the cool chill of night. "I will keep that metaphor in mind and cast it at a later date to an audience entrapped by my eloquent words." Ichigo's voice held a pleasant hum and the two lapsed into a comfortable silence born of deep kinship. A pinprick of something unknown, neither cold nor moist, landed on Ichigo's cheek with the softness of butterfly kisses. Looking up, Ichigo could see spirals of white trailing in heavy curtains towards emerald below. Confusion racked Ichigo's brow for a short few moments. The air was cool, but not so much that any precipitation would crystallize, and it was seemingly too early in the year for such an occurrence. "Is this snow? It is far unlike any I have yet seen." Byakuya's wondrous voice hinting confusion broke Ichigo from his thoughts for a second as chocolate orbs glanced around. The answer was soon evident in the scent that hung in the air like mist upon a foggy day. "This is not snow, it's ash." Byakuya's head whipped around to regard Ichigo, a serious expression lining his features. Ichigo placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, comforting him slightly along with his words. On this night many a fire may burn to keep spirits of ill will out of home, and yet this ash has a fragrance unfamiliar and toxic in its cloying descent. Shall we investigate? We can slip away without notice and be back before alarm. A war seemed to wage silently in Byakuya's head, curiosity vs common sense. Ebony locks swayed to reveal silver eyes alight with determination and a curious lace. Nodding with a warmth in his eyes, Ichigo cast away his Haori, setting it on the stone bench so as to not impede his travels. Following Ichigo's actions, Byakuya set his own Haori down, and with a nod they disappeared through a gate of wrought iron, shaped in simple patterns of vine and blossom. Casting his Reisu out in sweeping searches at a level unnoticeable to those that could sense Reisu, Ichigo landed on a sickening presence. Creeping forward in a flash step that left the soft rustling of leaf in his wake, Ichigo stalked towards the source. Byakuya was an anchor beside him, letting Ichigo center himself on the moment and not the simmering rage which frothed in his stomach and bubbled in his heart. After a great distance of miles were covered in a blur of fast travel, they stopped by a dirt road, weather-worn with deep indents from passing horse-drawn carts. Sharing a nod of understanding, they crept forward at a slower pace. A foul smell wafted through the air and Ichigo winced at the familiarity it brought. Fire soon lined their sight, great sweeping arches of crimson, sickly yellow, and faded orange. In front of the maddening light of the fire stood three figures, silhouetted by the harshly cast light. One was tall with brightly spiking hair standing in every which way. No orange scarf glittered in the overcast moonlight, but Ichigo would recognize the presence anywhere. That devoted and loyal to the bitter end man who was far too blind in his faith, Kaname-tuan. On the far left stood a figure of smaller stature, pale hair of ebony glistening like slick marrow. Jin Ichimaru was a peculiar character when considering his motives, but he had proved an invaluable ally in all his secrecy and spying. If he could, he would save him from the harsh end of impalement. If not for him, then Rangiku. Wrenching his gaze towards the middle of the two, Ichigo sucked in a harsh breath. His heart was a sudden fire and his hands were clenched unmovable. He let the pain in his palms ground him as red seemed to fill his vision. Shiro's growing rage and insane laughter echoed in the back of his head, and Ichigo wasn't sure who was tipping at that moment. A warm palm on his shoulders disturbed the bloodlust from his eyes and let the rage simmer down softly. The paleness of his face gave way to slight color with the soothing murmur at the back of his mind that was old man Zanjitsu. With the sound of blood no longer pounding in his ears, their words soon reached him. Another failure, Aizen-sama, another village sacrificed for your great cause. Tuan's voice was rasping lure that grinded Ichigo's nerves raw and left him biting his cheek, the bitter taste of iron filling his mouth at those words. This was not the first village that had succumbed to Aizen's thirst for knowledge and power. Experiments of what manner Ichigo could only guess were already being conducted. Ichigo, can you see who stands in front of the flames? Your eyesight is more like the hawk that glides over the battlefield, while I am the sleek raven who must stoop lower to see what your keen eyes may pick up. Ichigo's mind came to a grinding halt, and a flare of indecision iced his heart in its stone catacomb. To speak plainly of what he saw would lead to far too many questions and answers that would leave curious eyes burning his back, and yet his heart reached out to confer with someone. This endless doubt that plagued his mind, worry that haunted his every decision, and weary world tiredness left him aching to confide in someone other than his Zanpakuto. Casting his gaze towards Byakuya, Ichigo observed the softer lining of his face, the lack of creases in his forehead and around his eyes, the rawness that shined in silver eyes. Byakuya wasn't ready to shoulder such weight. He would protest if Ichigo ever said as much, but his walls were not yet high enough and no fortifications lay in their build. It seems these hawk eyes of mine have failed me. I can make only slight detailing, nothing noticeably defining. Byakuya frowned and seemed to pause, staring intently at the fire roaring and consuming the surrounding landscape. Turning to Ichigo, his baritone voice rang out in hushed tones and a questioning gaze pierced Ichigo's thoughts. Their voices sound familiar, as if I heard them in a dream or in swift passing. Should we venture closer and identify those who have wreaked havoc on this village? Ichigo frowned pensively. There were too many things that could go wrong if they decided to investigate. Byakuya was almost at captain level when it came to hiding his Reisu, but that wouldn't serve them well enough if they were in Aizen's range. Already they were cutting it close. There was also the increased risk of seeing Aizen's blade. Ichigo was already immune to the hypnotic effects of the blade, but Byakuya would easily fall prey to Aizen's illusions. The idea of Byakuya attacking him, thinking him to be an enemy, chilled Ichigo and left a small wedge of fear in the back of his mind. Ichigo was saved from answering as Aizen's head snapped back to gaze at the trees in suspicion, a flash of the moon illuminating brown hair and ice-cold eyes before being shadowed by dark clouds overhead. Turning to glance at Byakuya, Ichigo locked eyes and a shared sentiment transferred between the two, even in the veil of darkness that Byakuya's eyes couldn't pierce, those eyes of righteous ebony ice shined. Feeling the weight of his gaze leaving them, Ichigo took in harsh gulping breaths with a strange sense of fear plaguing him. Something unfamiliar struck a chord in his gut, leaving his instincts screaming to flee or fight. Grasping Byakuya's smooth hands in his own calloused ones, Ichigo pulled Byakuya deeper into the forest in a silent haste that spoke of the urgency in Ichigo's mind. Ichigo knew far too well to trust his instincts, as they have never led him astray, except for one time in the darkness of summer's blazing night, and they proved true again as where they once stood crouched in the shade of gnarled trees and stout bushes burst into ochre flames, painting the surrounding forest life in garish shadows. They continued to move faster and further into the forest until the smell of smoke was a faint whisper in the back of their minds, while ash still fell to the ground in a light dusting where in the slight clearing it coated the damp soil, suffocating the light of all below. When Ichigo judged them a distance far from sight or sound, he picked up into a flash step exceeding the speed of any academy student. Pulling Byakuya behind him, they soon arrive at the Kukaki mansion. Their hair is an array of strands windblown, dressed with flakes of white. Their yukatas show no trace of their travels but for the white powder and faint smell of smoke. In the garden, Ichigo slumped onto the bench, slipping the pale gray haori on and allowing some warmth to seep back into his system. Byakuya paced with a hurried frenzy throughout the garden. Glancing at the sundial placed in the east corner, Ichigo observed the time with a confused eye, still trying to puzzle this era's way of determining time. Looking at the moon's light position in the sky, Ichigo would say they were gone for maybe half an hour. Such short time for an event that seemed to drag on in its horror with sharp claws and scorching breath. I don't understand what we just saw. Ichigo. Byakuya turned to Ichigo, his muttering loud enough to brace Ichigo's ear and bring a slight sense of foreboding. This night held too much darkness and secrecy. The moon above in crescent form seemed to smile at him teasingly as he contemplated how best to respond to Byakuya's query. We can't speak of what we've seen, not yet. Too much danger and uncertainty lie in the events we witnessed. We must wait for evidence, a key factor or pointer that will lead us closer to the truth. Don't forget what you have seen, simply push it to the back of your mind and do not dwell on it. Byakuya's smile was weak yet hopeful, thanking Ichigo for his advice and promising kindness in return. He opened his mouth as if to speak more of the night's play but was interrupted by the thin shoji door that led inside sliding open. Kukeiko's ebony hair and pale face became visible in the golden warmth spilling from inside, her eyes cast about the garden searching before alighting on Ichigo and Byakuya. Slate eyes lit up as she stepped outside, her rose-colored kimono flowing around her ankles in controlled swirls. I've been looking for you two for 10 minutes. Kion and your grandfather say it's high time you graced the party with your noble presences. As much as I would like to escape into the night, we have roles to fulfill. Kukeiko's tone was slightly patronizing, but underneath warmth and humor swam in shallow seas. Nodding, Ichigo lifted himself from the bench, tightening the ivory scarf around his neck to keep the chill that racked his soul away. Byakuya looked slightly lost, torn between leaving the haven the garden provided and entering the chaos that was a gathering of flamboyant nobles. Ichigo rested a reassuring hand on Byakuya's shoulder, letting warm Reisu pool at his fingers and send warmth and comfort to Byakuya with a nod as chocolate orbs connected with slate eyes and Ichigo strode inside. Ichigo was waylaid nearly a dozen times as he ventured through the mass of writhing bodies. Byakuya's silky hair and carved face soon disappeared, likely trying to carve his own path towards his grandfather. His heart beat in an erratic pace as faces swarmed in and out of his visor, some far too familiar, leaving a burning sensation behind his eyes and lingering in the back of his throat. Feeling slightly lightheaded, Ichigo dragged himself over to one of the refreshment tables, allowing himself a moment to catch his breath. Letting his eyes sweep about the crowd, Ichigo searched for the familiar character of raven hair and identical face. Kion would provide some relief from the oppressiveness of the crowd and give Ichigo a shoulder to lean on. It was no use in this rolling mess of bodies, one could hardly tell red from blue or lady from gentleman. Closing his eyes slightly, Ichigo let the currents of Reisu sweep about him. To try and find Kion's presence in this mass of spiritual beings would be nigh impossible for any other being, but then again impossible didn't apply to Ichigo. After a few moments Ichigo's eyes flickered open and with a determined stride he entered the crowd once again. X. Ah, Ichigo, there you are. I'm glad Kukeku found you. The dull atmosphere was beginning to affect me. You look pale and your cheeks are flushed. Are you okay? Were you molested? Oh, woeful tidings. Tell me the perpetrator and my heavenly fury shall descend like a chorus of demons. Ichigo stared at Kyan in bemused surprise before laughter burst from his lips like the clear water from a fountain. Ichigo's humor seemed to overwhelm him for a moment before he took a few calming breaths and light shined from within caramel orbs. Kyan decided not to notice the slight tick of irritation that arched Ichigo's eyebrow. I was not molested in any way, Kyan. Calm your fury and satiate your anger in the knowledge that this drab affair shall soon pass. I'm fine, worry not about the pallor of my skin. Kyan smiled at Ichigo's reassurance, though concern still circulated through Kyan's system. Ichigo was indeed pale, his orange locks were strewn about in a wild manner as if Ichigo had taken a sudden run, and an almost fevered flush hung on his cheeks heightening the color of his eyes. Ichigo looked as if he needed a good hug, the desire to flee seemed to eclipse his eyes in half-moon shadows. I'm glad you're fine, I can introduce you to some of the more interesting nobles. The light that flickered in Ichigo's eyes again became steady and the darkness bled from his eyes leaving a light that was pale in comparison to the warm glow of Ichigo's laughter. Together they forayed into the crowd. Kyan could almost see a frown of grim determination on Ichigo's face and the image of him striding into battle with such expression haunted his mindscape. X. Kyan let his head tilt back to rest on the back of the plush chair he was lounging in, a deep weariness lay in his bones and his muscles ached unpleasantly. Kyan was more than pleased that the Kukaki party was over. It left a sense of relief tinged with dread of the next formal event. A shadow at his doorway drew Ichigo's sight towards the frame where darkness blocked out the low glow of the hallway. Ichigo. Kyan called out in slight confusion, easily identifying the potent Reisu that was bundled up inside Ichigo's lithe frame. Kyan was curious as to why Ichigo was here. By all rights the student should be in his room, probably fast asleep by now. Ichigo seemed hesitant about entering or even letting whatever troubles plagued his mind utter forth from his lips. A swell of determination seemed to resonate within Ichigo and he stepped into the light cast by the candles scattered throughout the room. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share a drink or two. Ichigo's question was laced with a hopeful uncertainty. Kyan gazed at Ichigo, scrutinizing the deep bags of lilac under his eyes and the limpness to his movements before nodding and letting Ichigo come and sit across from him. Standing up with a soft groan, Kyan padded over to his closet and reached inside one of the drawers, plain in design and look, but with a false bottom. A good security measure if Kukeku ever thought of stealing his sake. Glancing back at Ichigo, Kyan winked and held a finger to his lips before reaching in and pulling it out, a heavy ceramic bottle that sloshed with the sound of liquid inside. Sitting back down in the seat, Kyan frowned at the ache still occupying his bones. A concerned glance was cast his way before Ichigo said, I can help with the pain. If you'd like. Kyan regarded Ichigo slightly surprised before nodding and watching as Ichigo's calloused and scarred hands hovered over Kyan's leg and a warm emerald glow emanated from his palms. Kyan let out a sigh as the tension from his muscle disappeared, leaving him feeling as if he was dough freshly made and newly knitted. Ichigo smiled and sat back, and Kyan inclined his head before pulling out two pale blue sake cups and setting them on a narrow table between the two. With a flourish, Kyan let the clear liquid tip into the cups, raising them simultaneously to their lips. Ichigo smiled and said, to life and many more drinks. The ease with which Ichigo tipped the bitter drink back surprised Kyan, but it was Ichigo's words and mannerisms that left a deep-seated sense of unease in his gut. They were the actions of a man wishing to wash away guilt, grief, or some troubling event. Kyan shrugged minutely. He would ponder the matter later. For now the night was theirs to entertain. Soon the sweet caress of dawn would stroke their cheeks with golden rays. But it is the night where secrets may slip unbidden and truth may be unhindered. Filling the glasses once more, Kyan locked slate eyes with Ichigo's chocolate orbs and smiled, a smile full of promise. X. Chapter 9, Enamel. X. Ichigo stared at the blackboard at the front of the classroom with disdain. The winter holidays drew ever nearer, and still the teacher thought it prudent to litter the students with a litany of boring lectures. At least this day had a speck of brightness floating in the ashy light of winter days. The Suteiko for whatever reason had decided to come and visit the academy today. Ichigo theorized it had something to do with his ever-planning mind and like of an apprentice. Shifting slightly in his seat, Ichigo cast a knowing look in Byakuya's direction. The raven-haired student's eyes fluttered shut every few seconds and he would still for a moment before jerking awake, trying to keep sleep from overtaking his senses. Ichigo could sympathize. Sleep was like the sirens resting on rocky shores beckoning sailors towards a rocky doom. Her call was sweet and tantalizing. Ichigo knew well enough from experience what sleep held for him. Her sharp beak pecked holes in his soul and left gaping torrents where the sea water rushed in. Her talons left rivulets of crimson trailing into his eyes shadowing all light, and those feathers would cruelly tickle his senses promising something lost. Byakuya shook himself again and caught Ichigo's knowing gaze. A lazy smirk flitted across noble features and Ichigo responded in kind. A conversation passed silently, simple nods and hand gestures conveying inane topics and irritation at the teacher leading the class. Ichigo still wondered at the sanity of putting a paperwork class in the curriculum. It was simple-minded stuff. Heck, a sloth could easily do what the teacher said in long drawn-out explanations. The shuffling of bags being picked up, katanas readjusted, and paperwork being shuffled removed Ichigo from his musings and he glanced over to see Byakuya's overly amused face. Scowling, Ichigo stuffed rampant paperwork into his bag and slung Zanjutsu's sheathed form across his back. Standing up, Ichigo made his way over to Byakuya before they exited the small classroom that smelled like a crypt and was just as stuffy. It was indeed a mercy that the Suteiko was coming as they hurried towards the main courtyard. All the seniors would be missing the last class and for Ichigo this was more than a blessing considering it was Kido. The bustle of the crowds reached their ears long before the cool air whipped through their hair and pale sunlight glanced harshly off polished stone bricks. It was amusing to see such ceremonies in place for the visit, but then the headmaster was a pompous suck-up who couldn't tell the difference between someone's ass and the floor. Hissing slightly as they stepped into the crisp air, Ichigo pulled his shiakusho closer to his body and mourned the loss of summer while Byakuya laughed slightly, stilted by the cold creeping upon his shoulders. Ichigo's glare was heated enough to thaw the ice from Byakuya's shoulders and the two shared a teasing glance before the gates began to creak. With a great heave the gates shuddered and began to swing open, a large grating sound echoing throughout the courtyard and pierced the occupants' ears. The Suteiko swept inside, members of his squad closely following the bearded old man. A sense of unease lingered in Ichigo's gut as Yamaji stalked past. This powerful figure, guardian of Soul Society that Ichigo barely knew, cut down with swift ease. What part did he play? It was a question that sometimes lingered at the forefront of his mind. Ichigo flinched slightly as a Shinigami passed by them, ebony folds swaying in bitter wind. Looking up, Ichigo caught sight of emerald eyes hidden behind bangs of sharply cut gold. The man's rasu was sharp like a knife cutting at any who felt it, and while not evil or full of malicious intent there was something dark in the undercurrents of his rasu. Ichigo turned slightly, watching the light catch on golden strands before they faded into the distance. Ichigo felt like laughing at the pathetic display below. The headmaster in his infinite wisdom saw fit to hold a few duels to show the blossoming potential the students had to offer. Shaking his head, Ichigo scoffed at the thought. The headmaster's words were nothing but thinly veiled flattery with an air of flamboyance. Relief tinged Ichigo's thoughts as the image of the sign-up sheet nailed in front of the office drifted to the forefront of his mind. The burn of his instincts had swayed him away from signing the weary piece of parchment. Byakuya had gazed at the sheet for a moment before glancing at Ichigo, then back at the sheet. Ichigo was slightly proud when a critical light entered Byakuya's eyes and he turned away. Now they were gathered in one of the many dojos scattered around campus, the clash of blades ringing through the air and bright sparks sailing for a moment before fading like happiness. The Suteiko stood solemnly at the front of the dojo, a keen eye tracking every move and sword swing. Ichigo felt a touch of sympathy for the elder man as his bones must pain him after standing for so long a time. The duel before them finished quickly. A stroke unexpected flashed and the clatter of the other's blade hitting the soft matting echoed. Ichigo let out a relieved sigh. This was the last of them. Already 5 duels had taken place and in each Ichigo was unimpressed. The duelers were lacking creativity. They fought with the same boring basics taught to everyone in the academy. There was no improvisation, it was merely who was stronger or faster. A contest not of battle, wit, or spirit but of the body. Scoffing in disgust, Ichigo turned to face Byakuya, who gazed at Ichigo in amusement, understanding his friend's disgust with the battles so far. In a way, without Ichigo, Byakuya would have been much the same for many years before any real sense of style began to show. Ichigo had fixed that from day one of their training. Yes, it may have hurt his friend a slight, great amount, but it was well worth the results. Standing up, the two friends escaped the massive crowd streaming towards the exit, a sea of black and white crashing upon each other and leaving no semblance of order in the chaotic ocean of bodies. From a safe distance, with the bitter wind nipping at their cheeks, Ichigo and Byakuya watched the dojo empty of students, leaving only the teachers and members of Squad 1 inside. A few Shinigami trickled out of the dojo, their ebony uniforms a harsh contrast against the pale parchment sky peppered with only a few clouds varying shades of lavender and dull gray. Turning from the sight, Ichigo gazed up at the sky. The pressing weight of the future seemed to strangle him for a moment, his breath frozen in his lungs like the flowers wilted by the frost. Warmth on his shoulder and a heated gaze thawed the overtaking ice, and Ichigo slumped minutely, casting a thankful gaze in Byakuya's direction before straightening. The fog cleared from his mind, and slightly startled, Ichigo whipped around, surprised that his senses had not warned him of the incoming threat. 3 Shinigami were swiftly approaching their Reisu, a maelstrom of ill intent, a female with blood-red hair wrapped into a bun, a harsh face that with a smile may soften, and a Zanpakuto strapped to her waist led the group. 2 men followed behind her, one wiry with a hawk nose and overarching brows, the other was large and muscular, his face resembling that of a boulder with a few dents. The woman's scorching presence stopped a few feet in front of them, her eyebrows drawn together in anger and her lips pinched in a frown. Her goons hovered behind her, unsure and hesitant. Ichigo wondered how souls like these ended up in any squad. They were hemmed with a touch of darkness, and while some may overcome their shadow and push through to the light, others let it swallow them over time till they were corrupted, merciless, greedy, and any other sort of inane thing that plagued mankind. "You Kukaki bastard! I draw my sword, will you raise yours or flee like a coward?" Her voice pierced the air with shrill ringing notes, and the lust for battle was thick on her tongue. Before Byakuya could let a word slip, Ichigo stepped in front, drawing their attention. His voice resonated as he said, "Are you so low to challenge an academy student when you are already an accomplished Shinigami? And for what reason? You have not yet even given us your name, how so do you propose a challenge?" A scarlet blush painted her cheeks at Ichigo's cutting tone and reasonable questions. Flustered, she stared at the two before her, spine straightened, her head poised like a cobra ready to strike. "My name is Katsuryu. My family name need not matter. I challenge this Kukaki, who is far stronger than any academy student if his Reisu tells truth because of his kind. You nobles spit on us urchins in the street. We beg of your kind for food, anything, and you mock us. You with the bright hair are of the Shiba clan, therefore I turn my eye, for your kind may seem the weakest of the nobles, but to us you are mighty beyond words for your kindness." Ichigo frowned at her words. He knew such hate for the nobles was prevalent in those from Rungokai, but to let this anger fester and consume someone? He wondered how many there were like Katsuryu who would throw away their life for a chance to strike at those of higher class. Shaking his head, Ichigo let his eyes connect with Byakuya's, silver orbs shining in the paleness of night that was drawing closer. Byakuya nodded his head with reluctance, not for want of battle, rather that his teacher would fight this battle which Byakuya could claim his own. "If you are so persistent in fighting, then raise your Zanpakuto against me, for you offend my friend and speak wrongly so. This Kukaki in front of you bears no ill will towards any who live in Rungokai. In truth, he would rather them fed than the clothes on his back be threaded with silver. If you choose to stay blind, then I say again, raise your Zanpakuto and I will show you the error of your ways." X. Byakuya watched pensively, a tense silence hanging in the air as students began to stream towards the small group, sensing the increasing agitation and likelihood of battle. Katsuryu regarded Ichigo curiously, a war waging in cerulean eyes. The sound of metal scraping against scabbard cut through the air as she drew her Zanpakuto, the glimmer of metal flashing harshly. "Then I will fight you, Shiba, and once you are defeated I shall cut your friend down where he stands." Byakuya winced at her words and his eyes widened as his gaze was drawn to Ichigo. Very few could easily sense Ichigo's Reisu. He kept it swirled inside himself under tight control, and when he let it loose it was with the force of a tsunami. To Byakuya's eyes, Ichigo's Reisu seemed to trace him in shades of crimson, azure, ebony, and ivory. A determined frown rested on Ichigo's face, and his tangerine bangs shadowed the sharpness of caramel eyes that usually glowed with warmth but were now as cold and sharp as a knife. Gracefully Ichigo released his Zanpakuto from his sheath. The normally silver blade stained a deep shade of ink. Byakuya's eyes widened at the revelation. It happened rarely, but when Ichigo was emotional, hidden under his emotionless mask, or his energy bounded from him in waves, his Shikai would begin to show through its sealed state. Byakuya had never seen Ichigo's Shikai, though he had no doubt that Ichigo knew the name of his blade. the way they connected was proof against otherwise, but Byakuya knew that the blade was powerful and this development signaled danger to any who were foolish enough to tempt his wrath. In hindsight, the thought occurred that the reason anger coursed so swiftly through Ichigo's veins may have had something to do with the female Shinigami insulting Byakuya and threatening to kill him. Katsuryu smirked and raised her blade, a shallow bow forming at the waist before a wicked smile sliced her lips. Ichigo responded in kind, grim determination still carved into his features. A silent command echoed throughout the air and the Shinigami sprung forward, her goons standing like awkward statues in the background surrounded by the ever-growing crowd. Their blades clashed with the horrible shriek of metal against metal, Ichigo's greater strength showing as he pushed her blade down before dancing away. She growled and darted after him, her blade reckless in its assault. Ichigo parried her blow, striking underneath the blow and catching the edge of her shiakusho, leaving a thin tear. She looked down in surprise before outrage seemed to spark in her eyes. Katsuryu threw strike after strike at Ichigo. He parried each with ease, deflecting them to the side or tossing the opposing blade off. Not once did he draw blood, and when the opportunity presented itself in her weakness, even so he did not strike as often as able. Byakuya could see the weakness in her anger. Some could harness it and turn it into a deadly weapon, an almost unstoppable force. Others became sloppy. What finesse they once possessed fades away to something far from grace and not close enough to instinct. Byakuya could see that Ichigo was playing with her. His blade sailed with an aura of laziness, but his eyes did not delight in this. Rather, he stared into Lapis' eyes, trying to convey his message. The finale of the battle was drawing near. Byakuya could see it in the dawning understanding in Ichigo's eyes and the tense atmosphere that choked his breath. Ichigo was realizing that the lesson he was trying to teach through the sword would not reach this crimson-haired Shinigami. Too focused on blood was her mind. It also seemed that the clamor of blades and clash of the crowds had drawn the attention of the teachers and other squad members who previously dwelled inside the dojo. They now rushed forward, a varying mixture of awe and horror saturating their faces. With a final flicker of Reisu, the silver blade was flicked from the Shinigami's hand and she crashed to her knees, no blood spilling onto the dry dirt below, only sweat and the liquid falling from her eyes. Ichigo sheathed his Zanpakuto with a graceful curve and stepped forward, extending his hand. Her Lapis eyes gazed at orange hair and chocolate eyes in confusion, doubt, and fading traces of anger. She regarded the hand and Ichigo's voice broke the silence in soft tones. Take my hand and let this anger fade. Be happy in this duel and better your understanding. If you wish for Rungokai to be a better place, fight not within our ranks but against those who wander the streets at night. Feed the hungry and spread kindness. Teaching hate leads only to suffering. But if everyone can see good and spread its kind acts, then you have already made a difference. Byakuya could see the two paths before Katsuryu. She could throw Ichigo's offer away and wallow in misery and hate for the rest of her life, spreading violence on the streets. Or she could take his hand and reclaim happiness, take a different route and see what hope has to offer. The moment hung in tense silence before a soft smile alighted upon her face and she took his hands, the harsh demeanor fading with the laugh lines by her eyes and the upturn of her lips. Thank you. I have been so blind in my rage. You have opened a door I thought forever shut. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she buried her head in Ichigo's chest. Ichigo froze for a moment, the contact unfamiliar to him before he awkwardly patted her on the back, distress in chocolate orbs as they connected with Byakuya's own silver ones. Katsuryu pulled away and Byakuya smiled in seeing the soft upturn of Ichigo's own lips as he regarded the once wayward Shinigami. If ever you have need, I am in your debt. Worry appeared in an instant on Ichigo's face and he hurried to refuse, saying it was no debt. She responded in kind and Byakuya had to stifle his laughter at the picture the two redheads painted. Katsuryu turned away from Ichigo to face Byakuya. Hearing his laughter, a sorrowful expression laced her face as she said, I'm sorry for what I said. If you are willing, I would like to work with you and other nobles in bettering Rungokai. Byakuya smiled and inclined his head. Her eyes lit up and laughter burst from her rose-colored lips. Ichigo raised his head from where his eyes stared at the rough dirt below in thought, to see the Suteiko approaching, a gaggle of teachers and Shinigami following behind the elder man. The headmaster's mouth moved rapidly from a distance, words coming in a hurried flow like a dam-kept river had broken free. The words he spoke in frenzied tones became clear as they drew nearer. I apologize for this outrage. The student will be dealt with swiftly. Please forgive his misconduct. The words continued on in honey tones meant to please the ear and ease the mind. But the Suteiko ignored the words and was obviously displeased if the heat saturating the air was any indication of his ire. Would one of you care to explain why you have disturbed our meeting with your fighting? The Suteiko's withered and deep voice rang out with authority as he swept onto the scene, his Haori flying about him in the blazing heat that now lit the air, and while true fury did not shine in his eyes of coal, it seemed as if fiery vengeance would rain upon them all. Katsuryu bowed hesitantly before stepping forward. Straight tangles of ruby hair that had escaped the tight bun flowed in the wind. "It was my fault, Teiko. I challenged the Kukaki noble in my ignorance and anger. Shiba-san stepped in and took up my challenge. He thoroughly bested me and showed me the error of my thoughts. Forgive me for my ignorance." Her voice was still and sincere as she stared straight into Yamamoto's eyes, and not once did her voice waver in admitting her faults. The Suteiko stared thoughtfully at the three of them as the teachers began to usher the students away before his ancient voice said, "Is what she says true?" Ichigo nodded. To lie would only complicate the matters further, leaving a tangle of webs to uncurl, and the truth would be revealed by one of the many bystanders who cheered with each sword stroke. Yamji harumphed incredulously before weighing the options at hand. The headmaster, an ever-potent thorn at his side, seemed about to burst with the need to speak, his face an alarming shade of red that was starting to edge to mauve. "Katsuryu, to improve your skills so as to not bring shame upon the squad, you will take lessons from this student on sword fighting, and you will double your previous training regime. Shiba Ichigo, if I am not correct? Your skills are impressive and your blade sings with grace. Are you considering joining the first squad after graduation?" Ichigo swallowed heavily. There was the apprenticeship light in his solemn eyes. Ichigo had a feeling this was coming, if only because his Lady Fortune seemed to smile sadistically at him and watch him suffer. There was relief mixed in with the hesitance and despair at the prospect of joining the first. At least Katsuryu would not be banished from her squad for something so minuscule. In the background of their exchange, the headmaster was gawking like an overstuffed turkey as he stared at the Suteiko incredulously, obviously baffled by the Suteiko's gracious offer. Ichigo smiled softly at the knowing look on Yamji's face. The old man had obviously seen through Ichigo's efforts at hiding his skill in the blade, and if the arched, fluffy eyebrow was any indication, he could see the mosaic of colors his Reisu formed as it swirled around him. "Suteiko, you offer me great kindness with your question and compliment, however my heart does not sway towards the first squad. I am considering entering the 8th at first." The Suteiko raked his calculating eyes over Ichigo, considering the young man in front of him, assessing his decision before his eyes landed on the blade resting at Ichigo's hip. He seemed to understand, glancing between Ichigo's Reisu and the blade at his waist with a nod. "I look forward then in future years to seeing you as a member of my squad. Till then, thank you for that excellent display." Ichigo inclined his head and the Suteiko swept past the two students, Katsuryu falling in rank with her squad after winking at the two. Byakuya and Ichigo stared slightly numb as the squad disappeared through the iron-wrought gates of the academy. A sudden shiver racked Ichigo's body, tracing trails where sweat had run down his back in the steaming heat of battle. Byakuya turned, noticing the shiver of his friend, and frowned in concern. Meanwhile the teachers bustled about like headless chickens, the headmaster the rooster squat in the middle of the confusion. His gaze searching amber eyes soon landed on two heads of Ebony and Tangerine. Trading mischievous smiles, the two academy students burst away in a quick flaming flash step. Landing in the main hall, Ichigo let out a sigh as the warmth of fire ran throughout his veins, igniting a rosy tint upon his cheeks. Byakuya smiled at Ichigo, a flush also painting his cheeks, and in the dim candlelight of the main hall it stood out harshly against pale skin. The two shared a laugh, glancing towards heavy oak doors before striding towards Ichigo's dorm room, where Ichigo could make some steaming cups of tea, which were insanely good in Byakuya's opinion. Arriving at the dorm, Ichigo swept the door open, ushering Byakuya inside and gesturing to one of the many small cushions littered around a low wooden table. Though there was no real kitchen in the room, there was a counter which served well enough, a few cabinets, and a large jug of water which suited Ichigo's purpose, both now and at night when the feeling of blood sliding down his throat was thick. Pouring the water into a flower-patterned teapot fetched from a cabinet nearby, Ichigo glanced at the array of tea leaves kept in small clay pots, also on the counter. Opening one, Ichigo let the heady scent of chai float into the air, and he grabbed some of the leaves to drop in the teapot with a plunk. "Is chai okay?" Ichigo questioned, looking up to see his friend seated on one of the mats. Ichigo gestured at it. Byakuya nodded with a soft smile, and Ichigo nodded in kind before turning his attention towards the teapot. Holding the weight in his hands, Ichigo let warm Reisu seep from his hands, letting heat coalesce inside the ceramic. When a thin tendril of steam wafted from the thin pointed spout, Ichigo took his hands away and carried the ceramic over, setting it in the center of the table before fetching 2 mugs of matching pattern. Nodding his thanks, Byakuya gently poured the tea, a dark ruby in color, into their cups as Ichigo settled onto the cushion opposite Byakuya. In unison they lifted their mugs and took a sip of the steaming liquid. Ichigo let out a pleased hum as the rich flavor flooded his mouth and sweet warmth trickled through his center. Byakuya opposite him let out a content sigh and smiled at Ichigo before saying, "Excellent as always, Ichigo, thank you." Ichigo inclined his head in response, a pale blush painting his cheeks at the praise before they delved into a comfortable silence born of true friendship and gentle ease with each other. A question floated to the forefront of Ichigo's mind and his voice barely above a whisper and wanting to keep the silence asked, "Are you coming to the Shiba get-together? I think Kion invited you? It's just a chance to celebrate family, and give gifts, before New Year's rushes in with a bang. Yes, we received the invitation a few weeks ago, though I am likely to be the only Kukaki attending." Byakuya's deep voice rang softly in the room and Ichigo nodded, pleased with the prospect of someone entertaining, excluding the annoying bastard Kion, being there. Kion ran a tired hand over his eyes, his gaze sweeping from side to side as he entered the Shiba mansion. Ichigo would be home now that his break had started. His tired mind could barely comprehend the tight anxiety that pressed on his lungs as he entered the house. A sense of danger flared through his mind, igniting his big brother instincts into a frenzy. Looking around in fogged confusion, Kion took a breath, centering himself and letting the mist that seemed to hang onto every limb fade. Casting his senses out, Kion drew a sharp breath when he reached Ichigo's room. Even behind thick Kido barriers, Kion could sense distress and fear rolling in great suffocating waves, only to crash against unyielding shields. Quelling the instincts screaming at him, Kion sighed and paced into the kitchen, setting down the thick stack of paperwork for a moment before sliding into one of the plush cushions. Resting his head in his hands, Kion let the weight of the day slump from his shoulders. He wanted to help Ichigo, but he would be of no use wrought with tension. After a few minutes of silence, Kion stood up, leaving the messy stack of paperwork for the morning. Climbing the stairs with a few muffled curses and groans, Kion padded down the hallway and stopped in front of Ichigo's door. Taking a deep breath, Kion slid the door open and stepped inside. And was promptly choked as Ichigo's overwhelming Reisu slammed against him, drawing the breath from his lungs in harsh tugs. Wrapping a quick Kido shield around himself, Kion waded through the thick currents of Reisu that pooled around him like salt water. Drawing near to Ichigo's bed, he pushed aside long curtains painted black in the enclosing darkness of the room. Ichigo was sprawled across the bed, his orange locks a mess of sweat-soaked strands that clung to his skin. His skin was with the pallor of death in its paleness. A feverish sweat lay like a sheen upon his skin. His hands clenched and unclenched while his back arched or his face grimaced in pain. And worst of all this scene presented were the words that fell broken from Ichigo's lips. "I'm sorry, please forgive me. No, don't leave me. Stay with me, you're going to be okay, damn it, no. Stop, no, it wasn't my fault. I couldn't save them. I'm useless, I couldn't protect anyone. Why? No, please. I'm sorry." The words tumbled out of his mouth in soft pleading tones, like a child asking so innocently. The words struck the breath from Kion and his heart seemed to stop its steady beat, to stutter uncontrollably. Kion's face paled and his mouth hung open for a minute before he crept closer and laid his hand across Ichigo's burning forehead. Kion almost recoiled at the scalding skin. Turning to glance around the room, Kion spotted a pitcher of water with a cloth set neatly beside it. Rushing over, Kion soaked the cloth and wrung it out in a hurried manner, his heart racing in his chest. Turning away, he quickly strode towards Ichigo and placed the cool cloth on his forehead. A moan trickled from Ichigo's lips at the cool sensation, but he did not otherwise stir. Settling beside Ichigo on the bed, Kion stared in concern at Ichigo before gently running his hand through silky tresses heavy with sweat. The words "a continuous march" seemed to stumble upon Ichigo's breath, and Kion smiled minutely before gently channeling his Reisu in soft, comforting waves. It seemed to soothe the young man as he sank deeper into a dreamless sleep. His Reisu settled like the soft stilling of the wind. Kion considered Ichigo carefully before making to stand up. Ichigo's breath stilted, but he didn't resume his litany. It was peculiar to see Ichigo asleep so early. Usually the young student stayed awake until the early hours of the morning before sleep clawed her way into his mind. Often he would wake but a few hours later seemingly well rested, but the lavender under his eyes gave truth to the matter. Kion often noticed when they ate together that Ichigo ate little and always had a slight tinge of green to his skin. Kion wondered if Ichigo had finally crashed after the stress his body must have been going under. The fever suggested something of the sort. Stepping towards the door, Kayan paused, feeling the heat of the room stick to him like a second skin. Nodding to himself, he crossed the room and wedged open one of the circular windows. The pleasant and crisp air of night rushed in, taking away the cloying scent that hung about the air. A weight seemed to lessen on Kayan's chest, and he stalked over to Ichigo to place a kiss upon his forehead before sweeping out of the room towards Lady Night's tempting call. X. In the soft light of morning, Ichigo awoke, his head pounding a steady pulse, his skin hot and fevered, and coolness in the room that chilled him even while his flesh burned. Ichigo tried to recall the events of the night before, but was met with only a foggy memory of eyes drifting shut of their own accord and a mist descending on his mind. Cracking open his eyes, Ichigo gazed around his room, noting the open window that let pale streams of light glance off of oak wood flooring. A crispness hung in the air, and Ichigo shivered. His blankets pooled at his waist, revealing his scared chest to the teeth of wind. His door creaked open, and Ichigo hastily pulled his blankets up. Looking at the door curiously, a mop of sable hair appeared, followed by clear blue eyes. Kayan patted in, and a smile settled on his face when he saw Ichigo's chocolate orbs glancing about the room. "How are you feeling, Ichi? Gave me a scare last night when I came home." Ichigo took a breath, asked himself how he felt, thinking for a moment before saying, "Tired, sore, like I've been running for 2 months, hot and yet cold. I'm sorry I worried you." Kayan shook his head and came closer. Ichigo tilted his head in confusion until a cool hand settled on his forehead, providing some peace against the pounding in his head. Kayan sat himself beside Ichigo on the bed and said, "It's fine. It looks like you have a fever, so you need to stay in bed for few days." Ichigo began to protest but was promptly quieted by Kayan. "Are you going to be okay? You were having a pretty bad nightmare." Concern rang true in Kayan's voice, and Ichigo looked up, connecting with soulful eyes before letting his gaze drop and saying, "Remember when we got piss drunk and I told you about my family? I was dreaming of them." Kayan nodded, understanding dawning on his features. Once when they had sat down with a bottle of sake, they had gotten crazy drunk. It was one of the few times Ichigo was able to successfully fall under the influence. In doing so, he was willing to talk a bit more about subjects that he would otherwise be closed-lipped about. Kayan asked Ichigo about his family, and Ichigo spoke in soft tones of his sisters, mother, father, and friends in an almost detached reality, but it felt good to have the weight of secrecy lifted off his chest, even if Kayan only remembered bits and pieces the next day. "I'll be fine, don't worry about me, Kayan." Kayan smiled and shook his head in the negative before ruffling Ichigo's orange locks and standing up with savage glee. "I finally get to mother hen you, and Ichi can't stop me." Kayan was far too pleased for Ichigo's liking, and he let out a sigh of dread, preparing for the next few days. X. Kayan glanced around the room as he shrugged off his scarf, a pale blue in color, and hung it on one of the many racks lining the front hallway. The air was bitter with the chill of winter. Kukeka was holding a glass of sake in the corner, no doubt whispering the latest gossip to Yorichi, who was happily chatting away, plum hair glowing in the firelight shadows, a matching glass in her hand. Yukatake and Shunsui, who were stopping only for a short time as they had already made plans with the Kairo-raku clan, sat in another corner, Yukatake's ivory hair illuminated by soft candlelight as they shared knowing smiles. If the noise was any indication, Ganja was in the kitchen wiping up a storm of some kind, and if he was correct, Ganja was likely accompanied by one of his friends. A streak of orange attracted Kayan's attention. Ichigo was seated across from Yukatake and Kairo-raku, Byakuya sitting beside the orangutan nursing a steaming cup of tea. It was a wonder how one's eyes could trace over Ichigo so completely when his hair was so eye-catching. Striding inside, he was greeted with a chorus of warm welcomes. Nodding his head in greeting, he swept through and knocked on the frame to the kitchen. The door slid open to reveal a flour-spattered Ganja, who greeted Kayan with a beaming smile and took the fresh ingredients from his big brother's hands. "Smells good, I'm sure it'll taste amazing. Anything else you need from your big bro?" Ganja shook his head and made a small shushing motion with his hand. Shaking his head in amusement, Kayan turned away from the kitchen and meandered back into the living room, where an aura of contentment and warmth buzzed the air. Pensively, Kayan cast his eyes around the room before swiftly deciding and padding over to the small group gathered by candlelight, settling down with a soft plop. Yukatake's warm smile slipped across his face, and Kayan returned the smile in kind, always happy to smile for his Teiko, or any reason for that matter. Kairo-raku smiled as well, the kind that suggests something more, as his eyes flicker over to Ichigo, a silent question. Kayan nodded his assent, his eyes fierce orbs of determination displaying the truth in his smile. Turning slightly, Kyan could see the soft flush that still splayed across Ichigo's cheeks and over his nose, the almost vacant gaze and purple under his eyes, but his condition was better than the scene Kyan had witnessed a few nights ago. Ichigo almost leaned against Byakuya, who provided silent support for his friend, and Kyan could only approve the gesture. "So what exciting things were you talking about while I was gone?" Ichigo blinked, his eyes shadowing amusement before his voice came out sharp and steady. "We were talking about you." It was a simple sentence, but the tone behind the words suggested many other things were being discussed. Kyan smirked, happy that Ichigo's wit had not fled him in the exhaustion that weighed him down. "Talking about me? I'm flattered, really." To fake such obliviousness was quite fun. It left a sweetness in the mind that was only doubled by Ichigo's ire. Yukate's laughter pierced the silence, and he regarded Kyan with a knowing and amused smile. Kyan shrugged, which only raised laughter from the rest of the group. "So Ichigo still planning on joining Squad 8? Captain Kiriraku's question was phrased innocently, but Kyan could see the gleam in the cocoa-haired captain's piercing eyes. Ichigo straightened minutely, his warm chocolate orbs aglow with determination as he said, "I am almost quite decided." Kyan could laugh at Ichigo's words, always a tease, hidden of course behind intricate and sometimes eloquent words. Kiriraku smiled with some hesitance, mostly confident in his victory of Hirako Teiko. "Well, make sure you're quite certain by the end of the year." Ichigo only laughed at Kiriraku's words before nodding, Tangerine Bang's shading orbs radiating happiness. X. Chapter 10, Quarentia. X. Ichigo grasped at his knees, hunched over, his breath came out in large heaving gasps. Looking up, his eyes withheld a fearful glint as they scanned the long hallways that were the Shinigami Academy building. A rumble echoed ominously in the distance, as if cautioning Ichigo against incoming doom. Instantly his spine straightened, orange locks whipping about in wild frenzy as his head swung to the side. "Oh shit!" The words escaped Ichigo's mouth unfiltered as he stared down the long corridor, apprehension clear in his chocolate orbs. Nodding briefly to himself, Ichigo gathered his Reisu and fled the hallway, weary of the beasts that lurked behind him. Arriving with a slight tumble, Ichigo caught himself and looked around, seeing a familiar oak door. Ichigo let out a sigh and pushed the door to his first class of the day open. The classroom was near empty, with only a select few male students and a single female student perched at their desks. Letting his eyes cast over their collective heads, he spotted Byakuya's raven hair. Plopping in the seat next to his friend, he traded a tired gaze before slumping forward to rest his head on the cool desk. "That bad already?" Byakuya's voice, while holding sympathy, also seemed humored by Ichigo's apparent misery. Turning his head so a caramel could gaze at Byakuya from beneath a wave of tangerine, Ichigo frowned and shuffled his head in a rough nodding motion. Raising an eyebrow curiously, Ichigo sighed and said, "How did you survive 5 years of this nonsense? It's completely insane." Byakuya nodded, and Ichigo thought of days long gone where the Shinigami Women's Association had plotted many devious schemes themed with the time of the month. Everything from stalking captains to take photos, to having Mayuri help them make concoctions unfit for any human's consumption. It is quite the wonder. I think I spent more than a few of those days barricaded inside my dorm, if not the Kukaki mansion. I'm fortunate this year in that their attention now seems largely focused on you. What with senior year, I can't miss a day, or so the teachers preach. Ichigo laughed softly as Byakuya's words scattered the thoughts that ran rampant in his mind. The raven-haired student made a point. It seemed as if Byakuya was a sidekick in the attention Ichigo was receiving. Longing stares followed him throughout the hallways. Girls would hastily step in front of him and nervously present something uniquely made. They would follow in hordes, ready to tackle him and drag him to their homes. Ichigo shuddered at mere thought of such horror. The sound of the classroom's door opening reverberated throughout the room, the dull sound of unoiled hinges leaving a slight ache behind Ichigo's eyes. Looking up, Ichigo could see the teacher marching in, tawny hair swept up into a long ponytail that flowed elegantly. Behind her, Ichigo's classmates streamed in, their eyes raving about the classroom, searching for. Ichigo hoped it wasn't him, but Lady Fortune wasn't so kind as their beady eyes swung towards him. Slowly Ichigo sunk farther in his seat, letting his Reisu swarm up to camouflage him if only slightly. The teacher made an impatient noise, something close to the croaking of a frog in sound. Really, the woman was quite unpleasant in her teaching, spewing an array of useless knowledge as if it would assist them in life. Ichigo let out a relieved sigh as the penetrating stare abated and the students swarmed to their seats. Ichigo paced in a small circle outside the main gates, hidden from view by the large pillars that held the iron-wrought gate. The air was cool and a bitter wind nipped at his cheeks as if chastising him for his pacing. A short time later Byakuya's raven tresses made themselves visible as he prowled through the gates, his eyes casting about like a prey searching for the hunter that would swoop upon him and grasp him with mighty claws. Any trouble escaping the mob? Ichigo asked, an eyebrow arched in amusement. Byakuya huffed, staring at Ichigo for a moment before nodding. Ichigo smiled, and sharing a look they stepped away from the school filled with the chatter of excitable students. They arrived in Rungokai, one of the cleaner districts with a hospitable reputation, and more than a few stores of unique interest. Ichigo led the two to a small building squished between two large shops, one a kimono retailer and the other a butcher. The petite building had walls of mint green with worn cedar wood encasing the light walls, the sign above in faded letters in need of paint read, Utsukushi Tea. Ichigo pushed the simple wooden door open and a bell above let out a pleasant note. Stepping inside, the fragrant scent of freshly brewed teas floated on the air and pleased the senses. The room was filled with low wooden tables and plush mats of varying colors were scattered about unevenly, lamps hung from the ceiling and cast soft light upon all that it touched, and soft chatter filled the air. The store had a feel of well-worn comfort in a friendly atmosphere. A waitress bustled up to them, small in stature and sporting a shy smile. Her voice was soft and pleasant when she asked, "Table for two?" Ichigo nodded and the girl led them towards a low table, her red kimono fluttering behind her. The table was set against a wall where a window cast fading light upon their table. Settling down on the plump cushions, Ichigo smiled encouragingly and the waitress blushed before she said, we have 10 select teas on the menu today, and we also serve a variety of pastries and light snacks. I'm Asami and I'll be serving you today. What would you like to order?" Ichigo smiled softly at the girl, his eyes darkening slightly. She reminded him far too much of Momo, who had fallen prey to Aizen's charms with ease, stuck in the fourth raving delusions. She healed, partially, with time, but the girl was never the same, and she still suffered from attacks. It was one of those that cost her life. Byakuya coughed, disturbing Ichigo from his dark thoughts. Before looking at the waitress he said, "Do you have any jasmine teas? Also, I think I'm in the mood for a treat, whatever's there." The waitress blushed and responded in the positive before her gaze drifted over to Ichigo, landing upon bright tangerine strands. Ichigo smiled, and said, "I'll also have a jasmine tea please." Ichigo leaned in close to whisper into her ear, "Could you please add some sake to both teas? And a pastry for me as well please." "Yukir." Asami looked like she wanted to protest, but when Ichigo whispered the password she nodded and backed away to take their orders to the kitchen. The word wasn't so much a password as a symbol of your age, or so he had been told by debatable sources. It almost always worked, so Ichigo was thankful for the helpful tip. Raising his head to peer through messy locks, Ichigo saw Byakuya's gaze, pointed and full of curiosity. "What did you whisper to the waitress, Ichigo?" Ichigo smiled knowingly and Byakuya let out a sigh of long suffering, knowing well the meaning of that smile. They made idle talk for a few moments, talking about class while avoiding the topic of their horrendous experiences and likely tragic memories of the day. The waitress bustled back carrying a tray with a pewter teapot and 2 round cups. Accompanying the tea was a small plate with 2 pastries of golden color with a touch of red peeking out. Asami set it down gently, smiled kindly, and said, "Thank you for coming. You can leave the money on the table, and I hope you enjoy your date. Have a nice day." The waitress blushed before scurrying off, leaving a dumbstruck Ichigo and Byakuya. Ichigo let out a groan and mumbled, "This didn't happen nearly as much in my timeline." Letting his head rest on the table for a moment, Ichigo pouted and looked up to see Byakuya frowning, a concerned expression resting on noble features. "Do we just give off that aura? Why does everyone, and I mean everyone, think that?" Byakuya's question had sound logic, although Ichigo was certain that not everyone thought that. The idea still seemed to be common. Ichigo shrugged his shoulders with a tired sigh before picking up the steaming mug and tilting it towards his mouth. The rich fragrance delighted the senses, and as the hot liquid trickled down his throat a pleasant sweetness rested on the tongue. Placing the mug down with a smile, Ichigo looked at the treats that had been set before them. Wagashi biscuits lay in neat array with strawberries placed eloquently around them to present a beautiful image. "You always know the most unique stores, Ichigo. They are often a strange mix of nostalgia, comfort, age, and beauty." The offhand comment from Byakuya startled Ichigo slightly, and he looked up to see Byakuya nursing the cup of tea gingerly in his hands. A pleased smile resonated in his eyes. His hair glowed like sheets of ebony in the warm lighting cast by the oil lamps. Ichigo nodded, his eyes drifting over the crowd of people in the restaurant, a toasty homey atmosphere bubbling up and leaving a warm feeling in his chest. When one travels often, you see many things. Once I wanted to travel the world, let my feet lead me, no map, no compass, just my spirit. But plans change and life attacks relentlessly. I have things I need to accomplish before such dreams could be reality. Byakuya looked up slightly startled, noticing the whimsical gaze of Ichigo's eyes. Nodding a pensive gaze in silver eyes, Byakuya said, "Then one day when you have accomplished your goals, and we're both captains weary of subordinates, we'll travel the world together." Ichigo smiled and a soft laugh slipped from his lips. Shaking his head slightly, Ichigo cast a mischievous glance towards Byakuya and said, "And this is why they think we're in a relationship. Honestly though, Byakuya, what you say means a lot, though I don't know if we can last that long. Have you seen our classmates?" Byakuya laughed, the sound reverberating in Ichigo's own chest as he joined in. A smile of pure happiness rested on his face, untainted by the night. Byakuya turned, catching Ichigo's eyes, and said, "You spiked the drinks, didn't you?" Ichigo nodded, no trace of guilt shining in his eyes. Byakuya shook his head and with a shrug smiled happily. What do you do if your subordinate is bleeding?" Their blades clashed against each other, ebony against silver. Sweat dripped into Ichigo's eyes, his breath a harsh heaving inside his chest as he swung Zanjutsu in an overhead strike. Byakuya hastily raised his blade to block the incoming strike. Grinding his teeth, pushing Senbonzakura against Zanjutsu, he said, "Find source of injury and if need dispatch. Depending on size of injury, wrap with gauze or clean cloth, if available cleanse wound first, calm subordinate, and begin healing using Kido. If bleeding continues, apply more bandages and do not take away old ones. Stitching may be required depending on size. If materials needed are available, sterilize needle and thread, then begin." Pushing away, Ichigo nodded before stepping forward in a lunge, thrusting Zanjutsu in front of him. Byakuya stepped to the side and brought Senbonzakura down on Zanjutsu. Moving at the last moment, Ichigo twisted away and in Byakuya's confusion swept behind him, holding Zanjutsu to his throat. Shiro sang with glee, bloodlust pulsing throughout Ichigo's mind. He took a breath and tamped down on the feral instincts, making a mental note to relieve some of the tension in Hueco Mundo. "Well done, Byakuya, almost all the questions I asked were answered correctly. Your skills in the blade far surpass that of the average academy student. I have no doubt you'll be fine." Byakuya nodded his thank, pulling ebony strands heavy with sweat back into the ponytail high upon his head. Ichigo fingered his own long locks thrown into a messy ponytail where stray strands scattered every which way. Perhaps it was time for a haircut? The adamant no he received from his Zanpakuto spirits was answer enough for Ichigo, who shrugged and plopped onto the training mats below. "I still think it's ridiculous we have to take an exam. After all, we also have to do the exhibition battles in the same month." Ichigo nodded with sympathy. Their exams drew closer with every passing day, hence the improvised studying/battle. It's a method to improve those not in the exhibition fights score. Remember, only the highest ranking students are permitted to fight. Byakuya nodded, laying down on the hard mats and staring at the wooden ceiling above. Ichigo smiled and shuffled over slightly to sit beside his friend before laying down and looking up at the same ceiling. "Are you ready to become a Shinigami?" "I'm not sure if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. I am excited to help Soul Society and serve under my grandfather. But what if I amount to nothing?" Ichigo sighed softly, a weight pressing onto his stomach lightly. Turning his head to the side so he could look into Byakuya's eyes, Ichigo saw a burst of conflicting emotions: sadness, longing, tiredness, happiness, and confusion. Ichigo's lips quirked up slightly in an attempt at a reassuring smile. He said, "I think in heart and soul you are already a Shinigami. You can handle whatever weight is put on your shoulders, Byakuya. You have a will, a reason to fight. You are strong. It's in your eyes, your heart, your sword, and you won't amount to nothing. That's not your fate, you're more than that. And if you think you can wallow in misery and let it weigh you down, I will personally kick your ass to remind you of who you are." Byakuya smiled, his eyes going slightly misty as his hand clenched Senbonzakura's hilt in a tight grip. Nodding, he slowly stood up, stout resolution in his eyes. Ichigo nodded in kind and let his own legs lift him up. Was he ready to enter the fray, this web of politics and secrecy? He had no choice for them. His blade would strike clean through all hesitations. "Ready for round 15. Ichigo queried, shaking his bangs away from sight and whipping Zanjutsu forward in challenge. Byakuya nodded, Senbonzakura elegantly poised at his side. With a somewhat sinister smile on his face, Ichigo charged forward. X. Ichigo sank into his inner world, the water swirling around him, closed eyes flickered open and he looked at the sunlight, a far pinprick of light arched by towering buildings. Sighing softly, Ichigo let himself float in the cool water, tangerine locks dancing gracefully as bubbles floated past his lips. Closing his eyes once more, Ichigo let himself bask in the peace and utter silence. Stretching out like a cat, Ichigo let himself be drawn to one of the many skyscrapers piercing the clear water below. Shiro was hunched over on top of the building, his shocking white hair clear against the sky, a mix of crimson and cerulean. Ichigo tousled his hair and sat down beside one of his Zanpakuto spirits, gazing at the vista below them. Specks of emerald made themselves visible in small clusters scattered throughout the submerged city. Ichigo smiled softly at the sight, turning to look at the building closest, where a gaping hole lay in one side of the building. Vines curled out from the hole, wrapping around the sides and curling around chunks of debris. Farther inside the hole, rich brown bark made itself visible along with branches splaying out to display leaves of many colors. I see old man Zanjitsu got his wish. Ichigo's voice held the tone unique to his inner world. His voice seemed to bounce and tread softly upon the sound waves. Shiro nodded, his spine straightening slightly as gold eyes surrounded by a sea of ebony connected with Ichigo's. It's thanks to Yaking, or rather Yat, new friends. Shiro's dual-tone voice rasped out, echoing in the emptiness of Ichigo's inner world. Nodding, Ichigo tilted his head back, looking at the sky once more before saying, "The color in the sky is new. Was my world ever like this? Before it all happened?" Shiro turned a concerned eye upon Ichigo as thunderclouds rumbled ominously in the distance. The hollow-like being opened his mouth to speak when old man Zanjitsu's deep baritone rang out. "When your mother was alive, there was colors unbelievable and there was no skyscrapers. Afterwards the colors started to fade slightly and this city grew as your dream drifted farther away. I think once it was a mixture of landscapes, mountains, rivers, deserts, canyons, caves, forests. Time has changed that and time will change again." Ichigo turned to face old man Zanjitsu standing behind him, cocoa hair flowing imposingly in the non-existent wind, blue eyes hidden behind ochre lens, and his ebony robe floated on an almost invisibly wave by his feet. Ichigo took in what his Zanpakuto spirit said, considering the implications and meaning of such changes. His mind drew back to one of the passages he had managed to decode on one of the many nights hunched over brittle pages by candlelight. "And I saw that all I once was changing. It was not evolution. Maybe this fragile feeling is hope." The writer was vague and often puzzling, leaving far too many riddles to solve. Sighing, Ichigo let the thought go and leaned back against Zanjitsu's firm legs. "Are you ready for the task at hand tomorrow?" Ichigo nodded, looking up into fiery lenses. Ichigo said, "I will not hesitate. Here is the crucible and we are just starting. The future is behind and ahead of me. I will face it in all its burdens as I have before." Zanjitsu nodded, satisfied. Turning to Shiro, Ichigo smiled and said, "Try to contain yourself tomorrow. I plan to venture into White Sands soon." But King Ya not even gonna releasing ya real Shikai?" Ichigo smiled in reassurance at Shiro's pleading tone and said, "You know why I cannot release your true form yet? They would cower in fear and awe." With Shiro's nod, Ichigo leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting his mind rest, and the moon above him soothed the emotions that raged war in his soul, and the bitter claws of memory were put to rest. X. The air seemed to crackle with tension as chocolate eyes stared into Byakuya's own pair of slate eyes, fierce and full of determination. Mirrored in his own gaze, Byakuya knew this battle wouldn't be easy. The crowd that once roared as they approached had quieted to the barest shuffling and whispers. The piercing gaze of his grandfather drove into his back, reminding him of what he was fighting for, that and for Ichigo. A stray strand of tangerine fell across Ichigo's eyes, the rest pulled into a lopsided ponytail with curly ends. Byakuya felt a smile pull at his lips as they waited for the moment of battle to begin. With a sharp wave of his hand, the referee stepped back and Byakuya released Senbonzakura from his plain scabbard. The hilt was worn and familiar beneath his grip, and the soft whisper of spirit at the back of his mind filled his muscles with strength. Ichigo's Zanpakuto was drawn from his sheath inch by inch, in a slow, precise manner that displayed the silver of the blade, catching the harsh rays of sunlight. Flicking Senbonzakura in front of himself, pointed towards Ichigo, Byakuya shifted his stance, and as Ichigo shifted into a similar stance, the moment seemed to suspend itself like a drop of dew caught in gossamer threads. Ichigo struck first, his blade swinging forward to disturb Senbonzakura's thrust position. Nimbly Ichigo reversed his blade and lunged, driving the tip towards Byakuya's eyes. Byakuya flicked his blade up and the two pieces of metal clashed with an ear-splitting sound, sparks flying off the blades like wayward fireflies. Byakuya pushed against Ichigo's blade, leaning back slightly to avoid the point centered near his forehead. A devilish smile curled onto Ichigo's face as he pushed Byakuya's blade back, a contest of strength. Feeling a smile of challenge whip onto his own face, Byakuya twisted to the side, letting Ichigo's blade fall flat and thrusting Senbonzakura at his unprotected side. Silver flew up, stopping Byakuya's rapid ascent. Once more the two blades were locked. Stepping back, Byakuya watched Ichigo, noticing the peculiar tremor to his calloused hands. Byakuya was unable to think on the matter further as Ichigo stepped forward, katana raised high overhead. Byakuya darted forward to catch the blade from underneath. Ichigo twisted, letting the katana swing around to catch Byakuya from underneath. The two traded blow after blow, making no move in advance against each other. Byakuya stepped back, pushing sweaty locks aside, and raised Senbonzakura to rest vertically. His spirit purred in the back of his mind, excitement racing through his veins. Reisu gathered about him in soft folds of crystal blue. Breathing in deeply, Byakuya centered himself and let the Reisu pool in his blade. Scatter, Senbonzakura. There were hushed gasps from the audience as the blade separated into thousands of tiny pink petals, or so the crystalline blades appeared. The air was suddenly filled with the luminous crystals that was his Shikai, flowing elegantly around them in swift swirls. Lifting his head, Byakuya saw the excitement plain on Ichigo's face. Chocolate orbs were alight with glee and his lips carved upwards to form a smile. It was Ichigo who had aided Byakuya in achieving his Shikai, but it was Byakuya who had trained it, so it was a weapon. It would likely have taken many years before he was even close to touching Senbonzakura's Shikai. Swinging the hilt downwards, the petals flew at his command, coalescing and swirling to crash down upon Ichigo. With a quick use of flash step, Ichigo was but a blur, the image fading like a mirage in the desert. The tiny blades flew after Ichigo, trying to tear at his skin and clothes. Ichigo's blade dispersed the petals momentarily as the blade cut through the air in harsh and swift strokes. Springing back, Ichigo thrust out the silver katana in front of him, the blade slowly staining an ink in color around the hilt. Reisu began to surround Ichigo, a fierce wind lifting dust from the ground and relieving the trees of the few leaves budding into existence. Chocolate eyes seemed to glow blue for a moment, a frown of concentration laced his features, and his voice rang out in the silence as he said, "Rise Zanjitsu." Ebony Reisu curled around the blade, sheathing its form from sight. As the Reisu faded away, Ichigo's Shikai was revealed. The blade was pure onyx in color and it was far longer than any regular katana. The hilt was a crossguard that wrapped around in a circle with pointed crests. Sharp spikes curved from the blade near the hilt with deadly points. The hilt was covered with a fabric of deep sable and hidden beneath was crimson fabric. At the end of the blade a chain hung, making a clear tinkling sound, and at the end of the iron chain a crescent shape hung. Rose petals raised in challenge and Ichigo responded in kind, raising Zanjitsu. Senbonzakura flew forward, trying to engulf Ichigo in its swirling mass of blades. Ichigo was already gone, drawing near to Byakuya. Hastily the blades created a wall and began to surround Ichigo. A shock, or orange and sadistic smile was all that Byakuya could see of Ichigo from beneath the cover of pink. Getsuga Tensho. A wave of obsidian and lapis burst through the collection of petals, hurling straight towards Byakuya on a path of destruction. Byakuya stepped away, letting Flash Step carry him far from the carnage as it dispersed where he once stood. Turning around to face Ichigo, Byakuya channeled his Reisu into his outstretched hand. Heido No. 4 Byakurai. Pale white lightning arched from his hand towards Ichigo, who arched an eyebrow in surprise before raising his blade, letting the Heido clash against the onyx blade, sending sparks ablaze. Byakuya could feel his strength being seeped by the spell. Letting it fall through, Byakuya raised Senbonzakura only to feel the cool press of metal against his neck. Byakuya's chest seemed to fall in great heaving blows as he struggled for breath, cool sweat beading his face and running down his back. Where Zanjitsu touched his neck, Byakuya could feel muted whispers in a Reisu that was utterly confusing in its duality. "I surrender." Ichigo nodded behind him and the blade fell away, letting Byakuya breathe easy once more. Turning around slowly, Byakuya let his Shikai fade and with a tired smile he eloquently sheathed Senbonzakura, who whispered proud nothings in his ear. Ichigo mirrored him, sharing the same look with a hint of amusement in caramel eyes. Bowing low to each other, Byakuya whispered, "It would be a miracle for me to win this battle. Thank you for fighting with your Shikai." Ichigo's eyes peered out from a curtain of tangerine and he nodded before they straightened up and extended their hands to shake. Cheers burst out around them. Like a stadium of wild beasts the noise rose seemingly endless. It was only when the Suteiko rose did the noise fall quiet, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Well done, that battle was most formidable. Whichever squad receives you should be honored to have you amongst their ranks. In sync they turned and bowed to the Suteiko, mischievous grins hidden under their bangs and presented as humble smiles. Together they turned and left the arena. There was still a few more battle to follow. Kyan's mind was a crash site. It was as if a meteor had conveniently decided to destroy his brain after the duel he had just witnessed. The two had released their Shikai. And they were spectacular. Byakuya's was powerful with elegance, beauty, and a million opportunities. Ichigo's blade screamed power in the curves of its hilt and in the screaming wave of power that it unleashed. Stalking forward, Kyan followed his senses, letting them lead him to where Ichigo and Byakuya hopefully were. More than a few times Kyan had followed only to find empty space. Yukatake Teiko and Kiraraku Teiko followed behind him a small distance back. A quiet conversation between the two. Kukaki Teiko had opted to stay and watch the final duels, preferring to confront his grandson at a later time. Letting his gaze raise from where he was staring pensively at the earth below, Kyan spotted Ichigo and Byakuya. The two students were under a great elm tree with furrowed branches where a few leaves of emerald budding in the fresh spring air caught the fading sunlight. Ichigo's vibrant orange strands were visible against the pale folds of Byakuya's uniform. The two were leaning against the tree, soft whispers drifting from their lips. Ichigo's head tilted and caramel orbs locked onto Kyan's eyes, and a small welcoming smile slipped onto Ichigo's face. Smiling in return, Kyan bounded over much like an excited puppy. He could hear the huff of laughter behind him as the two captains followed him. That battle was excellent. Your sword strokes were swift, and your shiokais were amazing to behold. A light dusting of rose painted Byakuya's cheeks, and Ichigo looked down, hastily gathering himself for a moment before letting his gaze rise. Byakuya smiled kindly and said, "Your words are very kind, thank you." Kyan smiled and strained his ears to hear the mumbled thank you that slipped underneath Ichigo's breath. Kyan scowled slightly before brightening again as Yukatake and Kiraraku arrived, placing a warm hand on his shoulder, softly reassuring him. "So have you made your decisions on which squad you're joining?" Kiraraku's soft baritone rumbled inquisitively. Byakuya laughed slightly before pointing at the carved silver kensei kin in his hair, a gift from Ichigo that the young noble had appreciated greatly. Ichigo remained quiet for a moment, seemingly lost in thought, till Byakuya jostled his shoulder slightly. Ichigo shook himself, orange hair swaying wildly, and said, "Yes, I've decided the 8th is the best squad for me right now." Kiraraku let out a pleased noise. Trading a wink with Yukatake, he leaned over and whispered into the white-haired captain's ear. Kyan nodded, equally pleased. He trusted Kiraraku and knew the man would look after his baby brother. It also gave him an easy excuse to drop in any time and say hello. Stretching slightly, the nip of a cool wind tickled his cheeks and left goosebumps rising along his arms. "Well, I think this call for a celebration. If I recall correctly, tomorrow you are graduating." Ichigo and Byakuya nodded hesitantly at Kiraraku's inquiry, trading glances filled with meaning. "Well then, surely we can get you too drunk. The ceremony isn't till nighttime anyway. That's plenty of time to get over a hangover. I remember one time Ju and I were piss drunk for a captain's meeting, well, more than once. I think we started writing a ballad about old Yamjiai." Ichigo laughed at Kiraraku's words, and Kyan couldn't help the chuckle that escaped his own lips at the mere image of the two hunched together during a meeting, scribbling on a stray piece of parchment and murmuring like a band of thieves. "Shoo, it wasn't totally like that though. I am quite sure Yamamoto was on to us, if the eyebrows were any indication." The name was said with long-suffering fondness, and an exasperated look was thrown Kiraraku's way. Kyan chuckled and cast a curious gaze towards the two students sprawled against each other and asked, "So are you two interested?" The two shared a glance, with Ichigo shrugging and Byakuya raising an eyebrow as if they understood each other through those simple gestures. Silence reigned, accompanied by an aura of good humor and warmth as the students debated. Finally Ichigo turned to face them, a strange light in his eyes like shards of gemstone hid within caved depths. "We'll go, what have we got to lose, other than our dignity?" Byakuya let out a slight huff at Ichigo's boastful words. Glaring at his friend, he said, "You know he's going to kill me. He's already after my tail thanks to the biscuit incident, as you've so fondly dubbed it." Ichigo doubled over laughing, clutching his chest as his face became an alarming shade of red. Byakuya just laughed and patted his friend on the back, leaning over to whisper something that sounded vaguely like karma. Byakuya shook his head and stood up before extending his hand to Ichigo, who took it after a few deep breaths, the rouge fading slightly. Kairaku and Yukatake shared conspicuous glances. Kion pouted, and said, "It's not fair, you both have besties and here is Kion the poor third wheel to your duets." Ichigo stepped closer to Kion before extending his hand and patting the top of Kion's head, leaving a warm trace of heat where his palm rested. Ichigo's voice was mocking and full of sarcasm, and with a smirk he said, There Kion." Kion batted Ichigo's hand away with a growl, and Ichigo's laughter, accompanied by Yukatake, lifted his heart. Shaking his head, Byakuya flicked Ichigo on the nose before gesturing in a lead-the-way manner. X. Ichigo growled in enjoyment as Zanjutsu cut through the hordes of hollows that surrounded them, mismatched eyes of chocolate and gold staring at a sea of white and red. Laughing, his voice came out in the dual-tone rasp familiar to Shiro. Ichigo smiled, feeling the Reisu he had constricted so tightly over the year spill forth and decimate the weaker hollows, striking at them like a cobra. The sand rose up to swirl around them, the grains flying like small droplets of rain as a Getsuga Tensho tainted crimson and ebony raced over pale sand. Ichigo could feel the tension bleed from his shoulders, Screw Aizen, and his readings. It was unlikely that the sociopath's readings even reached this far, or that any espada had ventured close to the swirling vortex that was the end of Hueco Mundo. Ichigo had stumbled upon it when he was separated from his team and was chased by Ulquiorra for 5 days straight. The apathetic hollow could be surprisingly determined when it came to Aizen's orders, but that was before Orium convinced him to join Soul Society, after she raised him from the dead. Letting himself sink back into his inner world, he let Shiro take the reins, the ivory horns and bone mask appearing along with the pale skin and red tribal markings. Shiro let out a crow of glee, Zanjutsu like a chainsaw in his hands as he whipped back and forth, taking out hollows with a pleasured intensity. Ichigo looked up in surprise as he felt a warm hand resting on orange locks. Blue eyes hidden behind the yellow lens of Zanjutsu's glasses stared down at him fondly. "You are not worried about falling off the edge?" Ichigo shook his head, laughing. He had done that once, pushed by a friend turned traitor. Ichigo had flailed in wordless fear as the air seemed to escape from his lungs. His skin had felt cool, like he was drawing near death's door when the sand wrapped around him and set him upon silk grains. It was a mystery for Kisuke or another time. Looking up at the pale crescent moon in a sea of gray, Ichigo sighed and let Reisu trickle from his hands, sprouts breaking through the concrete to curl and wrap around his fingers. In the softness and silence of Hueco Mundo, Ichigo could feel a quiet not easily found. The solitude of the place was like his inner world in some ways, and yet the feel of sand beneath your toes and the release of pent-up Reisu had its perks. X. God damn it. Captain Kairaku, you can drink your sake all you like, just please stop using your bottles as paperweights. Ichigo sighed as he shifted the bottle off the stake of paperwork Shunsui was signing. Really, the man didn't have to be so surprised that Ichigo could copy any signature. Then again, it probably wasn't a common skill and one well suited to Shunsui's needs. Ma Ichi so mean. Ichigo did not usually yell at his eccentric captain, but that was the 5th time this afternoon that sake had spilled on the paperwork. How there could be stacks hidden under the carpet was still a mystery Ichigo had yet to solve. Lisa huffed in the other corner of the room, ebony hair in 2 long braids, round glasses hiding piercing Aegean eyes from sight. Her short shiakusho swirled around her thighs as she stood up. Ichigo winced slightly in looking at her. Guilt and grief, twin forces, still haunted him every time she spoke, and his failure to protect her was a bitter reminder and resolving determination. Turning to face Ichigo, she smiled slightly. Shifting her glasses, she said, "Want to come get lunch with me, Ichigo? Kiriraku Teiko can stay here in this dim office and finish the paperwork." Ichigo nodded, heaving himself up from the desk and stretching like a cat he stalked towards the door, Lisa following behind him, blind to Shunsui's whining in the background. Exiting the barracks, the 2 Shinigami entered Rungokai, the familiar smells and sounds welcome to the stunted shuffling of paperwork that filled the small office. Walking down a crowded cobble street, Lisa turned to face Ichigo with a friendly smile. Ichigo could see why she was being so kind. He was a new face, they shared the same captain, and they were likely to be stuck together for more than a few years. "Know any good restaurants, Ichigo?" Lisa queried, eyes roving around the crowded streets, glancing at the many shops where people traveled often and carved wooden signs. Ichigo nodded and said, "One up ahead serves fantastic sandwiches and tea." Aegean eyes sparkled beneath clear glass lenses, and she nodded with a smile before frowning and asking, "Do you mind if I go and see Nano-chan first?" Ichigo nodded, his eyes understanding before slightly uncertain. He asked, "Do you mind if I come with?" She nodded and the two left the crowded streets in a flurry of dust and flash step. Heading towards Nano, Ichigo suppressed a slight shudder at the thought of seeing the stern lieutenant reduced to a doe-eyed child. It's funny, from what I hear the squad members already consider you co-lieutenant and it's only been a week you've barely settled in. Ichigo arched an eyebrow in surprise as they walked towards the restaurant, a comfortable aura surrounding the two. Lisa had been impressed with how easily Nano connected with Ichigo, and Ichigo was having a silent panic attack on the inside the whole time, but he was fine, mostly. Zanjitsu was there, so it's alright, kinda. As they were about to enter the restaurant, Ichigo, a Jigo Kuko of Deep Raven, landed on Lisa's shoulder. Cocking her head slightly, a frown slipped onto her face and her brow furrowed slightly. Turning to Ichigo, a serious light in her eyes, she said, "They need us in District 81, there's reports of a hollow attack." Ichigo sighed and with a shrug nodded his head, determination pooling in caramel orbs. Lisa connected with his eyes and they darted off, leaving the restaurant behind once again. They arrived on a scene of havoc. A few of the lower seats were scattered about the scene of chaos, splotches of crimson staining the white of their shiokshos. The other Shinigami were surrounding a large hollow bleached pale white with trails of ochre down its body. It had the rough shape of a bear and claws like one too. Immediately Lisa and Ichigo loosed their Zanpakuto from their sheaths, twin blades of silver glinting in the sunlight. On light feet they raced towards the hollow, Ichigo inclining towards the front while Lisa darted around to the back. Distracting the hollow was an easy matter. Hato and Bakuto slipped from his outstretched hands and in one swift motion the hollow was finished as Lisa's Zanpakuto cleaved through its mask. A roar sounded to the left of them as the hollow in front began to disintegrate. Another one barreled out of the trees. Ichigo jumped, letting his blade raise, and in a graceful arch he sliced through the mask, feeling bone crumble beneath his blade. "Is that the last of them?" Lisa asked one of the Shinigami standing about in dim wonder. The Shinigami startled and nodded her head repeatedly. Lisa questioned the female Shinigami for a bit longer before turning and striding over to Ichigo. "We can head back to the squad, she can handle the rest." Ichigo nodded and mourned the lost lunch for a moment before following Lisa and letting his mind mourn the incoming paperwork in its stead. Lisa turned with a smirk as they skirted over Rungokai and said, "We'll have to make up lunch sometime." Ichigo nodded and her lips curved up slightly as they landed in the familiar courtyard of the barracks of Squad 8. Shunsui came out to meet them, the smell of liquor potent on his breath, and evident in the tip of his straw hat and disarray of his flowered kimono. "Enjoy your lunch?" "Lisa-chan, you're too mean, leaving me here all alone and not inviting me, and Ichi, you're supposed to stand up for me." Lisa snorted dismissively, shaking her head, sending twin tails swirling, while Ichigo laughed, a slightly apologetic light in his eyes. In a sincere voice Ichigo said, "We are very sorry for this grave offense, Captain." Shunsui snorted, seeing through the blatant lie, and turned, hiding a smile under the plain straw hat. Sharing a conspiratorial glance, Lisa and Ichigo followed their captain up carved steps and through familiar wooden doors. Check the description for the links to the author.